A dead man's papers changed history. It was 1784. A rider was galloping through the Bavarian countryside, carrying documents so sensitive that only a handful of people on earth knew they existed. Then lightning struck. The horse threw its rider. The man was dead before he hit the ground. His body lay in the mud while the storm scattered his papers across the road. When local police arrived and collected those soaked, torn pages, they had no idea what they were holding. But as they began to read, something shifted. The officers went pale. Within days, those documents were on the desk of the Bavarian ruler. Within weeks, every royal court in Europe had heard what was inside them. It was proof. Not a rumor. Not a conspiracy theory. Actual written proof that a secret network had been operating right under the noses of kings, governments, and churches. A hidden organization with real members, real plans, and real goals that went completely against everything those rulers wanted to protect. And here is the most fascinating part. That organization, the one whose cover was blown that stormy night, was not some ancient mythical brotherhood. It had only been founded 8 years earlier. By a single professor. In a small German city. With just 4 friends. That is where this story begins. Not with shadowy figures in black robes. Not with ancient pyramids or secret handshakes. It begins with a simple and deeply human question. Why do people hide? Think about the last time you kept a secret. Maybe it was small. Maybe it changed everything. Either way, there was a reason. Secrecy gives you something. Control. Safety. Power. Or simply the comfort of belonging to something others cannot touch. Now multiply that feeling by 1,000 people, spread across a dozen countries, all bound by the same hidden oath. That is a secret society. And they have existed in every civilization, in every century, on every continent in recorded history. Not as fairy tales. As real organizations, with real members, doing real things that shape the world you live in today. The history books you grew up with tell a clean story. Kings made decisions. Armies fought battles. Scientists made discoveries. Events had causes, and causes had names. But there is another version of history running underneath that clean story. One where the real decisions happened in private rooms, where the most important conversations were never written down, and where the people who actually moved the pieces were never the ones standing in the spotlight. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is just how power has always worked. Here is something your brain does automatically, and you cannot stop it. When you find out you know something that other people do not know, your brain releases a small rush of reward chemicals. The same system that fires when you eat something delicious, or when someone you like pays attention to you. Knowing a secret feels good. Being chosen feels even better. Secret societies did not create this. They discovered it. And then they built entire organizations around it. Every secret society that has ever existed, from the mystery cults of ancient Greece to the encrypted online networks of the modern internet, runs on the same basic engine. You are chosen. You swear an oath. You are given knowledge others do not have. And then you are told that more knowledge is waiting, if you prove yourself worthy of it. That structure keeps people loyal. It keeps them committed. And it keeps them quiet. The genius of it is that the secret itself does not even have to be spectacular. What matters is the experience of receiving it. The feeling of being on the inside. The bond formed with the people who went through the same process beside you. In ancient Greece, there was a religious ceremony called the Eleusinian Mysteries. It ran for over 1,000 years. Hundreds of thousands of people went through it. Some of the most famous thinkers in history participated, including Plato, Cicero, and Marcus Aurelius. Every single one of them kept the secret of what happened inside that ceremony. Not one reliable account of the central ritual has ever been found. Think about that. 1,000 years. Hundreds of thousands of people. Not one leak. That is not magic. That is psychology. And understanding it is the first step to understanding how secret societies actually work. Now, before we go any further, let us be clear about what this is and what it is not. This is not a tour through every wild conspiracy theory ever invented. We are not going to claim that shape-shifting beings run world governments, or that every major event in history was scripted by a single hidden organization sitting somewhere in a dark basement. Those stories exist, and they are entertaining, but they are not what we are here to explore. What we are doing is following the evidence. Real documents. Real membership records. Real historical accounts from people who were there. We are going to look at organizations that actually existed, and ask the honest question. What did they really do? How much power did they really have? And where did they ultimately go? Some of what you find will be smaller than the legend. The Bavarian Illuminati, one of the most feared secret societies in history, lasted 11 years and never had more than 2,000 members. The story that grew up around them after they collapsed is 100 times bigger than anything they actually accomplished. But some of it will be bigger than you expected. The Knights Templar, who most people think of as religious warriors, actually invented international banking. They created a financial system so powerful that a king of France eventually had to destroy them just to cancel his debts. And some of it will change the way you see things happening right now, today, in the world around you. Here is the thread that runs through all of it. Power has always needed to hide. Not because the people holding it were necessarily evil. Sometimes they were. But more often, it was simpler than that. When you know something others do not, you have an advantage. The moment that knowledge becomes public, the advantage disappears. The priests of ancient Egypt understood this. They could predict when the Nile River would flood, which in that world was the difference between a harvest and a famine. They kept that knowledge locked inside temple walls, passed down through initiation, guarded by oath. To the outside world, it looked like divine power. In reality, it was astronomy. Careful, patient, brilliant astronomy that they had no intention of sharing. That gap between what was known and what was allowed to be known, that is where secret societies live. That gap is where they draw their power from. And that gap, in different forms and through different technologies, has never closed. It is still there today. The names have changed. The robes have been replaced by closed-door meetings and private invitation lists. The secret handshakes have become security clearances and non-disclosure agreements. But the structure is identical. A small group of people who share information that others do not have, bound together by shared knowledge and mutual interest, operating just outside the view of the general public. Once you see that pattern, you cannot unsee it. So here is what we are going to do. We are going to travel through history, from the temples of ancient Egypt to the encrypted corners of the modern internet, and we are going to trace the pattern wherever it appears. We will look at who built these hidden networks, why they built them, what they actually managed to accomplish, and where they failed. We will separate the documented history from the myths that grew around it. We will ask hard questions and follow the evidence honestly, even when the answers are less dramatic than the legends. And by the end, you will understand something that most people never do. You will understand how power actually moves in the world. Not the official version, not the conspiracy version, but the real one. The one that has been operating in the background for 3,000 years. The game behind the game has been going on longer than you think. And now you are about to learn the rules. Imagine waking up every single morning not knowing if your civilization will survive the year. That was life in ancient Egypt. Not metaphorically. Literally. Every year, the Nile River would either flood or it would not. If it flooded at the right time, the soil soaked up nutrients, crops grew, people ate, the kingdom survived. If it flooded too early, too late, or not at all, crops failed. Animals died. People starved. An entire civilization balanced on the edge of a river's mood. Now imagine that in this world, one group of people could predict exactly when the flood was coming. Weeks in advance. Sometimes months. They would stand in front of the crowd, raise their hands toward the sky, and announce the date. And they would be right. Every single time. To the average Egyptian farmer standing in the dust and heat, watching these men speak with absolute confidence about the future, there was only one possible explanation. These men talked to the gods. But they did not talk to the gods. They watched the stars. What the priests of ancient Egypt had built, quietly and carefully over many generations, was one of the most sophisticated astronomical observation systems in the ancient world. They tracked the movements of specific stars, particularly a star called Sopdet, which we now call Sirius. When Sopdet rose on the horizon at a specific angle just before dawn, they knew the flood was approximately 2 weeks away. They had correlated star positions with flood timing over hundreds of years of careful record keeping. They had built mathematical models. They had essentially created a science. And then they locked that science inside the temple and swore every person who learned it to absolute secrecy. Think about how brilliant that decision was. Not brilliant in a sinister way. Brilliant in a purely strategic way. The moment that knowledge became public, the priests lost everything. Any farmer who understood the star patterns could make the same predictions. The divine mystery would evaporate overnight. The priests would become just men, not messengers of the gods. So they protected their advantage the only way available to them. They controlled who could learn it. They created a system of levels, where new initiates learned small pieces of information over years, and only the most trusted inner circle ever understood the complete picture. They surrounded the knowledge with ritual, with ceremony, with symbolic death and rebirth experiences designed to make initiates feel that what they had received was sacred and not to be given away lightly. They invented the secret society. Not on purpose. Not as a grand plan. They invented it because they understood something that would be rediscovered by every powerful organization for the next 3,000 years. Controlling information is controlling power. And the most effective way to control information is to make the people who hold it feel that sharing it would be a betrayal of something sacred. Walk through the ruins of the great Egyptian temple complexes today and you are walking through something that most tourists completely miss. Yes, the carvings are breathtaking. Yes, the scale is overwhelming. But look past the art and you start to see the structure of an institution. The temples were not just places of worship. They were research centers. They were libraries. They were schools. They were banks. They were hospitals. And they were organized in exactly the same way that every effective secret organization has been organized throughout history. Outer areas were public. Anyone could enter. There were rituals, ceremonies, prayers. The common people participated. The priests performed. Everything looked open and accessible. But behind the public areas, there were restricted zones. Deeper rooms. Smaller, more private spaces. As you moved further into the temple, the number of people permitted to enter shrank. The knowledge available grew more specific, more technical, more powerful. At the very center, in the innermost sanctuary, only a tiny number of priests were ever allowed. And what was kept there was not necessarily what most people would imagine. Not gold, though there was gold. Not just religious objects, though those were present. What was most jealously guarded were texts. Records. Calculations. Medical knowledge. Astronomical data. Chemical formulas. the accumulated technical expertise of generations. When archaeologists excavated the tombs of high-ranking Egyptian priests, they found medical papyri describing surgical procedures so advanced that historians initially refused to believe they were genuine. Procedures for setting broken bones, treating infections, even performing basic brain operations. This was not the work of primitive shamans waving feathers. This was systematic, documented medical science. The priests had medical knowledge that the rest of the ancient world would not rediscover for over 1,000 years. And they kept it inside the temple. Because the moment it left, they lost the power that came with being the only people who could heal the seemingly unhealable. Here is the question that should be sitting in your mind right now, and it is the question that runs underneath this entire story. Is that wrong? Is it wrong to protect knowledge that gives you power? Is it wrong to create a system where information is shared only with those who are deemed trustworthy enough to receive it? Is secrecy inherently evil, or is it just a tool that can be used for good or ill depending on who holds it? Hold that question. We are going to keep coming back to it. The Egyptian priests did not stay in Egypt. As trade routes expanded and empires rose and fell, their organizational model spread. Egyptian priests appeared as advisors in Greek city-states. They showed up in Phoenician trading ports. Persian kings sought their counsel. And wherever they went, they brought the template. Initiation. Hierarchy. Progressive revelation of knowledge. The fundamental equation that restricted information equals concentrated power. The Greeks took that template and did something remarkable with it. They turned it into philosophy. Picture a procession moving through the Greek countryside in the month of September. The road stretches 14 miles from Athens to a small city called Eleusis. And walking that road are people who have not eaten in days. They have been fasting as part of the preparation. The September sun is still warm. Their feet are sore. Their minds are loose from hunger and from days of ritual preparation. Around them walk hundreds of others. And these are not ordinary people. Yes, there are farmers and craftsmen in the crowd. But there are also senators, generals, philosophers, and poets. There are Roman governors. There are military commanders who have led armies across continents. There are men who will shape the next century of Western civilization. All of them are walking the same road, in the same condition, for the same purpose. They are going to the Eleusinian mysteries. For over 1,000 years, this ceremony was the most significant spiritual event in the Greek and later Roman world. It ran from approximately 1600 BC until the late 4th century AD. During that time, it is estimated that hundreds of thousands of people participated. Some of the most famous names in ancient history were among them. Plato, who founded Western philosophy, was initiated. Cicero, one of the greatest orators who ever lived, was initiated. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome and one of history's most disciplined thinkers, was initiated. Hadrian, another Roman emperor, made his initiation a major public event. And every single one of them kept the secret. That fact is almost impossible to absorb. Think about who we are talking about. These were not simple people who could be easily intimidated. These were powerful, educated, sophisticated individuals who lived in societies where gossip and political exposure were constant threats. They had enemies who would have paid handsomely for any embarrassing revelation. Some of them were writers who recorded detailed accounts of nearly everything else in their lives. Yet on this one thing, they said nothing. Cicero wrote that the mysteries had taught him how to live with joy and how to die with hope. He called it the greatest gift Greece had given to Rome. And then he said nothing more about what actually happened inside. Plato wrote in veiled language about seeing beyond ordinary reality, about glimpsing something that completely reframed his understanding of existence. His entire philosophical framework, the theory of forms, the idea that the physical world is a shadow of a deeper reality, may have been shaped by his experience at Eleusis. And yet he never directly described what he saw there. What happened inside that hall? What experience was so powerful that it silenced hundreds of thousands of people across more than a millennium? Historians have been trying to answer that question for centuries. And they have developed some fascinating theories. The most compelling theory involves a drink called the kykeon. This was a ritual beverage consumed by initiates before they entered the main ceremony. Ancient accounts describe it as a mixture of water, barley, and mint. That sounds harmless enough. But growing on the barley in ancient Greece was a fungus called ergot. Ergot contains compounds that are chemically related to what we now know as LSD. A researcher named Gordon Wasson, along with the chemist Albert Hofmann, who was also the scientist who first synthesized LSD, published a detailed study in 1978 arguing that the kykeon was a psychedelic brew. That the Eleusinian experience was essentially a carefully managed and ritualized psychedelic journey, interpreted through the lens of Greek religious symbolism. If they were right, then what the initiates experienced was a profound alteration of consciousness. Ego dissolution. The feeling of merging with something larger than the individual self. The sensation of seeing through ordinary reality to something that felt more fundamentally true. The experience of what many people describe as a confrontation with both life and death simultaneously. And that experience, interpreted through the framework of the Demeter myth that the mysteries were built around, would have felt like genuine divine revelation. Like actually touching the truth of existence. No wonder they did not talk about it. Not because they were afraid of breaking a rule, but because the experience was so far outside ordinary language that describing it felt impossible. And because the oath they had taken felt not like an external restriction but like a genuine commitment to protecting something sacred. Other researchers point to elaborate theatrical staging inside the darkened initiation hall. Hidden machinery. Light effects. Dramatic appearances of priests dressed as gods. Carefully choreographed experiences designed to overwhelm the senses and create the feeling of supernatural encounter. Archaeological excavations at Eleusis have revealed sophisticated architectural features that could have supported exactly these kinds of dramatic productions. Underground passages. Rooms with unusual acoustic properties. Spaces that would have been pitch black except for controlled light sources. Perhaps it was the drink. Perhaps it was the theater. Perhaps it was both, working together to create an experience of overwhelming psychological intensity in people who had been prepared through days of fasting, walking, ritual bathing, and focused intention. Perhaps, as some scholars suggest, it was neither of those things. Perhaps the experience was primarily psychological. The power of expectation. The power of shared ritual. The power of being surrounded by hundreds of others in a state of collective vulnerability and openness. The human mind, in the right conditions, can generate experiences that feel every bit as real and transformative as any chemical or theatrical trick. What we know for certain is this. It worked. Whatever happened in that hall, it produced experiences so meaningful that some of the most rational and sophisticated thinkers in human history counted it among the most important moments of their lives. And it produced loyalty so absolute that the secret survived for more than 10 centuries without a single reliable breach. That is a record that no modern organization has ever come close to matching. If you had the chance to go through the Eleusinian mysteries and experience what Plato and Marcus Aurelius experienced, would you take it? Or would the oath of secrecy put you off? Let us know in the comments below. The Eleusinian mysteries were the most famous of the Greek mystery cults, but they were far from the only one. All across the Greek world, similar organizations operated on similar principles. The Orphic mysteries were built around the figure of Orpheus, the legendary musician. Their central teaching was that the human soul was divine but trapped inside a mortal body. Through cycles of reincarnation, through living according to specific ethical principles, and through the knowledge gained in initiation, the soul could eventually escape the cycle and return to its divine origin. Sound familiar? These ideas later appeared in Gnostic Christianity. They appear in Platonic philosophy. They appear in various Eastern religious traditions. The concept of the soul as a temporarily imprisoned spark of divine fire, the idea that knowledge is a form of liberation, these are some of the most persistent and influential ideas in human spiritual history. And their most organized early form was the Orphic mystery cult. Initiates of the Orphic mysteries were buried with remarkable objects. Archaeologists have found thin sheets of gold, rolled up and placed in the mouths or hands of the dead. When unrolled, these sheets contain detailed instructions. Passwords to be spoken at specific moments in the afterlife journey. Directions for navigating through gates guarded by supernatural beings. Instructions for choosing the right path at critical junctions. Think about what that reveals. These were not just vague spiritual believers. They had a detailed, specific map of what happened after death. A map that they had received through initiation, that they took seriously enough to carry with them into the grave, and that they trusted completely enough to stake their eternal existence on. Whether you believe in that map or not is beside the point. The point is what the existence of those gold tablets tells us about the organization that produced them. This was a group with serious intellectual content, real organizational structure, written texts that were carefully guarded, and a member base committed enough to follow through on their beliefs all the way to the grave. But here is what most histories of the ancient mystery cults miss. The spiritual content was only half the story. Maybe less than half. The mystery cults were also the most powerful social networks in the ancient world. When two strangers met in a Greek marketplace and one of them made a specific gesture, and the other recognized it and responded correctly, something immediate happened. Trust. Not just polite commercial trust. Deep, bone-level trust of the kind that comes from knowing that this person has gone through the same experiences you went through. That they have sworn the same oaths. That they are bound by the same commitments. In a world without reference checks, without credit scores, without legal contracts that could be enforced across borders, that kind of instant trust was enormously valuable. It meant you could do business with someone you had never met before and feel relatively secure about it. It meant that when you traveled to a foreign city, you could find people who would help you, shelter you, give you access to their professional networks. The mystery cults were essentially an ancient version of a global professional network. They operated across ethnic lines, across class lines, across the borders between competing city-states. A slave who had been initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries shared a bond with a senator that their official social positions would never have allowed. That cross-class, cross-cultural networking function was one of the main reasons these organizations survived for so long and spread so widely. They offered something genuinely valuable. Not just spiritual experience, but practical advantage in a world where who you knew was the most important currency available. The Romans, always practical, recognized this value immediately. As Roman power expanded across the Greek world, Roman leaders did not suppress the mystery cults. They joined them. Julius Caesar was said to have been initiated. Emperors Augustus and Hadrian made a point of participating in the Eleusinian rites. The Roman aristocracy adopted the Greek mystery tradition enthusiastically, because they understood that the networks it created were worth having. And then something happened that would change the trajectory of the entire Western world. Rome, approximately 64 AD. The city has just experienced the worst fire in its history. A significant portion of Rome is ash. The Emperor Nero needs someone to blame, and he chooses a small, strange sect that meets in basements and underground tunnels and refuses to worship the Roman gods. He calls them Christians. What follows is one of the most brutal programs of persecution in the ancient world. Christians are arrested, tortured, and executed in creative and horrifying ways. They are thrown to lions. They are crucified. They are burned alive and used as human torches to light Nero's garden parties. The Roman government brings the full weight of the most powerful military machine in history against this small, strange, secretive movement. And it does not work. Not only does the persecution fail to eliminate Christianity, it seems to make it stronger. Every execution creates martyrs. Every arrest introduces the Roman legal system to the movement's ideas. Every public death is witnessed by people who cannot understand how someone can face that kind of end with the kind of peace that these people display. Within 3 centuries of those garden parties, Christianity is the official religion of Rome. How? How does a tiny movement of mostly poor, mostly uneducated, mostly marginalized people defeat the greatest empire the world had ever seen? The answer lies in organizational structure. And it is an answer that modern intelligence agencies have spent decades studying. The early Christian movement had accidentally built something that military strategists now recognize as one of the most resilient organizational structures ever devised. It operated in cells. Each group, usually meeting in someone's home, knew its own members. It might have some contact with a traveling teacher or messenger who connected multiple groups. But no individual cell had a complete picture of the entire movement. No single person, even a senior leader, could have given the Romans a full accounting of how many Christians existed, where they all met, or what they all believed in fine detail. This meant that when Rome arrested Christians and used torture to extract information, the information extracted was real but limited. A prisoner could name the 20 or 30 people they met with on a regular basis. They could name 1 or 2 traveling teachers. They could not name the thousands of other Christians scattered across the empire, because they genuinely did not know about them. Modern security professionals call this compartmentalization. It is the most important principle in designing any organization that needs to resist infiltration or exposure. Each member knows only what they need to know to do their part. Information is shared on a need-to-know basis. The structure means that losing any one part of the network does not compromise the whole. The Carbonari would use the same structure in 19th century Italy to coordinate revolutionary uprisings. The CIA would use it in the 20th century to run networks of agents behind the Iron Curtain. Al-Qaeda used it to operate globally after September 2001. Every organization that needs to survive against a much more powerful adversary eventually discovers the same principle. The early Christians discovered it first. Not through strategic planning. Through necessity. Through the hard experience of learning, cell by painful cell, what happened when too much information was concentrated in too few people. The early church also had something that every successful secret society throughout history has had. A reason for people to join that went beyond ideology. Yes, the spiritual teachings were powerful. The promise of eternal life, of justice for the poor, of a God who saw and valued every human being regardless of their social status, these were radical and compelling ideas in the Roman world. But the early church also offered something more immediate and practical. Community. Mutual aid. A support network. In the Roman Empire, if you were poor and you got sick, you were largely on your own. If you were poor and your husband died, you and your children were in serious danger. The social safety nets that modern people take for granted simply did not exist. The early Christian communities functioned as mutual insurance societies. Members pooled resources. When someone fell ill, the community helped care for them. When a family lost its breadwinner, the community provided support. When someone needed work, fellow Christians helped find it. When someone arrived in a new city as a stranger, other Christians provided shelter and introductions. This practical benefit was enormously attractive to the poor urban populations who made up the early church's primary recruitment base. Joining was not just a spiritual decision. It was an economically rational one. You gained access to a support network that genuinely improved your chances of survival. The combination of powerful spiritual content and immediate practical benefit, wrapped in a structure that was almost impossible to destroy through external force, made early Christianity something that Rome had never encountered before. A movement it could not buy, could not frighten, could not torture into submission, and could not even kill effectively, because every execution seemed to generate more members than it removed. Do you think the early Christian church's survival was primarily due to its organizational structure, or was there something else at work? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We genuinely want to hear what you think. When Constantine became emperor in the early 4th century and made Christianity the favored religion of Rome, something fascinating happened. The underground movement did not abandon its secret society structures. It formalized them. The hierarchical structure of bishops, priests, and deacons mirrored almost exactly the degree systems of the mystery cults. The catechism system, where new converts were taught progressively more detailed doctrine before being admitted to full membership through baptism, was essentially the same progressive revelation structure that the Eleusinian mysteries had used for 1,000 years. The closed communion, where only baptized members could participate in the central ritual of the Mass, maintained the insider-outsider distinction that is fundamental to every secret society. The confessional, where the most private details of a person's life were shared with a representative of the institution, created the vulnerability bonds that mystery cult initiations had always been designed to produce. Christianity had spent 3 centuries being shaped by the pressures of operating as a secret society. And those structures had worked so well, had proved so effective at creating loyalty and maintaining organizational coherence, that they became the bones of the institution even after the need for secrecy had passed. The tactics of the persecuted became the tools of the powerful. The structures that had kept a small movement alive against the greatest empire in the world became the organizational framework of the most powerful institution in medieval Europe. That pattern repeats throughout history. The organizational innovations born of necessity under pressure become the lasting legacy of every successful underground movement. Jerusalem, 1119 AD. 9 men are kneeling in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site in Christian belief. They are knights. Experienced fighters. Men who have seen war and know what it costs. And they are making vows that should be impossible to combine. Poverty. Chastity. Obedience. These are the vows of a monk. And the vow to take up arms. To fight. To kill, if necessary, in defense of the pilgrims traveling to the holy city. No one had ever done this before. The Catholic Church had very clear ideas about what monks did and what soldiers did, and those 2 things were not supposed to overlap. A monk who killed was violating his nature. A soldier who lived in poverty and celibacy was failing his duty to society. These were separate categories. You were one thing or the other. These 9 men decided they would be both. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. History would call them the Knights Templar. And within 2 centuries, they would have built an organization so powerful that it could lend money to kings, and so threatening that a king would arrange their mass murder to escape his debts. The early years were genuinely difficult. 9 knights, however dedicated, were not much of a force. They patrolled the roads around Jerusalem, trying to protect the streams of European pilgrims who were being robbed, attacked, and killed on the journey to and from the holy sites. There were too few of them to do much. They were poor, as their vows required, sharing horses and equipment. But word of what they were doing reached Europe. And Europe responded. The Church gave them extraordinary support. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued a papal bull, essentially a statement of church law, that placed the Templars outside the jurisdiction of any secular ruler. They answered only to the Pope himself. They were exempt from local laws. They paid no taxes to any king or baron whose land they operated in. They could build their own churches and conduct their own religious services without needing the permission of local bishops. They kept all the spoils of war they won in battle. Think about what that meant in the context of medieval Europe, where the church and various kings and nobles were constantly negotiating and fighting over exactly who had authority over what. The Templars existed outside all of that. They were a sovereign organization operating across the entire known world, answerable to no earthly power except the Pope. Money poured in. Wealthy Europeans who wanted to support the Crusades but could not fight themselves donated land, property, and money. Minor nobles sent their younger sons, who would not inherit their father's estates but who wanted honorable careers. Merchants recognized the value of having allies in the dangerous territories of the Middle East. Within 50 years, the Templars had grown from 9 men sharing horses to one of the largest and wealthiest organizations in medieval Europe. They held property in every Christian country. They operated fortresses that stretched from Scotland to Palestine. They had their own navy. They had their own diplomatic corps. They negotiated treaties with Muslim rulers on their own authority. And then they did something that no one had seen coming. They invented banking. Consider the problem they were uniquely positioned to solve. A merchant or pilgrim in Paris wants to travel to Jerusalem. The journey takes months. The roads are dangerous. Bandits operate everywhere. Carrying gold or silver is essentially painting a target on yourself. But you need money to travel, to pay for food and shelter and transportation along the way, and to do business when you arrive. The Templars had the solution. They had fortified commanderies, essentially fortified bases, stationed along every major route from Western Europe to the Holy Land. And they had something else. They had a reputation for absolute reliability and military strength. No one tried to rob a Templar facility. So they created the letter of credit. You deposited your money at a Templar house in Paris. You received a document, encoded in a cipher that changed regularly and that only the Templars could read, stating how much you had deposited. When you arrived at a Templar facility in Jerusalem, you presented the document, proved your identity, and withdrew the equivalent amount. Your gold never moved. It sat safely in Paris the whole time. Only the information moved. And because only the Templars could decode the documents, forgery was essentially impossible. This is the foundational idea behind all modern banking. The transfer of value through information rather than through the physical movement of wealth. Letters of credit, wire transfers, digital payments, cryptocurrency. They are all variations of what the Templars invented in the 12th century. And it worked so well that people quickly realized it was useful for more than just pilgrimages. Merchants began using the system to conduct trade across enormous distances without the risk of carrying physical currency. Nobles began storing their wealth in Templar vaults, knowing that the combination of Templar vows and Templar military strength made their money safer there than in any royal treasury. Kings began taking out loans from the Templars to fund military campaigns. The Templars were not just warriors anymore. They were the financial backbone of the entire Christian world. At the peak of their power, the Knights Templar controlled more liquid wealth than most European kingdoms. They held mortgages on royal properties. They managed the personal finances of popes. They funded wars and crusades that determined the political map of 3 continents. And they kept their organizational secrets with the same fanatical dedication that had always characterized the most effective hidden organizations. Their initiation ceremonies were private. Their internal communications were encrypted. Their chain of command was clear but deliberately opaque to outsiders. Non-members who encountered Templar operations saw only what the organization chose to reveal. This secrecy, which had once been a practical necessity, eventually became their vulnerability. Because when you are powerful enough to threaten a king, and secretive enough that no one outside your organization knows exactly what you do in your rituals and your private meetings, you become the perfect target for a smear campaign. King Philip IV of France had a problem. He had borrowed enormous sums from the Templars to fund his military campaigns. The debts were staggering, growing, and unlike loans from ordinary creditors, the Templars had the military strength and international backing to actually demand repayment. Philip could not fight them openly. The Templars were popular, respected, and protected by the Pope. Any direct attack would look like what it was, a king trying to rob an institution he owed money to. So he went indirect. He spent years carefully building a case. He gathered testimony, much of it extracted through torture, from people willing to claim that the Templar initiation ceremonies involved heresy, denying Christ, worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet, engaging in obscene acts. He planted stories. He cultivated allies within the church. He prepared everything with the patience and thoroughness of someone planning a military campaign. And then, on Friday the 13th of October, 1307, he struck. At dawn, simultaneously across the entire Kingdom of France, royal officers opened their sealed orders and moved to arrest every Templar they could find. Thousands of men were taken in a single morning. The speed and coordination of the operation was extraordinary, something not matched in scale until the organized law enforcement operations of the modern era. The Templars, despite their famous intelligence networks, had no warning. The timing was deliberate. Friday was already considered an unlucky day in medieval Europe. The 13th was associated with the 13 people at the Last Supper, one of whom was a traitor. By staging his mass arrest on this particular combination, Philip was sending a message wrapped in symbolism. Some historians believe this event is the origin of the superstition about Friday the 13th being unlucky. If so, a medieval king's political murder operation has shaped the superstitions of billions of people for 7 centuries. What followed was one of the more squalid episodes in European history. Templars were tortured into confessing to crimes that most of them had never committed. The confessions contradicted each other. The stories changed depending on what the torturers seemed to want. Under conditions of extreme physical pain, people will confess to almost anything. The Grand Master of the Templars, a man named Jacques de Molay, initially confessed under torture and then publicly recanted when given the opportunity to speak before a church commission, declaring that the confession had been false and that the order was innocent. He was immediately sentenced to death for relapsing into heresy, the medieval legal term for someone who had confessed and then denied their confession. He was burned alive on an island in the Seine River in Paris, in March 1314. Accounts from the time say he continued to proclaim the order's innocence as the flames rose around him. Legend says he called out a curse on Philip and Pope Clement V from the fire, predicting that both would die within a year. Both did die within months, though this was almost certainly coincidence made significant by the timing. The Templar treasure, the legendary accumulated wealth of 2 centuries of banking and crusading, was never found. Philip seized Templar properties in France, but the gold, the documents, the relics reported to be in Templar possession, these vanished. Some historians believe a significant portion of the wealth reached Scotland, where the king at the time, Robert the Bruce, had been excommunicated by the Pope and had no reason to honor Philip's arrest orders. The story that Templar treasure found its way to Scotland and was hidden there has been generating theories, novels, and treasure hunts for 7 centuries. The reality is probably more mundane. Some was hidden. Some was seized by other monarchs who followed Philip's lead. Some had never been as large as the legend suggested. But the mystery has proved immortal. Here is a question that historians still argue about. Do you think the Knights Templar were genuinely guilty of any heresy, or was the whole thing a fabricated smear campaign by a king who simply wanted to cancel his debts? Tell us what you think in the comments. What the Templars left behind was more than mystery and legend. They left behind a template for organizational power that every large institution since has studied, consciously or not. They demonstrated that a private organization could accumulate resources and influence that rivaled nation-states. They showed that military capability combined with financial control was a form of power that kings genuinely feared. They proved that a global network, bound by shared ritual and unbreakable oath, could operate across borders and jurisdictions in ways that no government of the time could match. And they illustrated the fatal lesson that every powerful secret organization has had to learn eventually. The moment you become too visible, too wealthy, and too threatening to be ignored, you have stopped being a secret society and started being a target. The Templars had kept their rituals secret. But their wealth and power had become impossible to hide. And in the end, it was the visible power, not the secret rituals, that destroyed them. Their organizational DNA did not die with them, though. It filtered into other organizations. Into the Freemasons, who adopted stonemason imagery and created something entirely different. Into the banking systems of Italian city-states, which continued and developed the financial innovations the Templars had created. Into the political imagination of every movement that would ever try to build a network of committed, oath-bound people operating across national borders toward a shared goal. The Templars failed. But their ideas survived them. Here is something that should be more disturbing than it sounds. For most of the Middle Ages, if you wanted to bake bread professionally in a European city, you had to swear a blood oath. If you broke that oath, you might never work again. Your children might never work again. Entire families were effectively blacklisted for generations because one ancestor had violated the code of a professional association. We do not think of medieval guilds as secret societies. They are not dramatic enough. There are no underground chambers, no coded rituals involving ancient gods, no legends of hidden treasure. They were tradespeople. Bakers, blacksmiths, weavers, glassmakers, stonemasons. But look at how they operated and the structure becomes unmistakable. Every guild operated on a 3-tier initiation system. Apprentice, journeyman, master. Sound familiar? It is literally the same progressive degree structure that the Eleusinian mysteries used for over 1,000 years. You entered at the bottom knowing nothing. You worked and learned for years, sometimes over a decade. You were tested. You advanced. And only when you had proved yourself completely could you access the highest level of knowledge and the privileges that came with it. The knowledge itself, the techniques that made one craftsman significantly better than another, was never written down. It was transmitted orally, from master to apprentice, in private, protected by oaths. The Venetian glassblowers of Murano had techniques for producing high-quality clear glass that were so valuable to the Venetian economy that the workers were literally not allowed to leave the island. Glass workers who attempted to emigrate to other European cities were pursued. Some were assassinated. The Venetian government treated the glass secrets as a matter of state security. The German bros of the medieval period guarded their formulas with similar intensity. The specific recipe for clear, Stable lager beer that would not spoil during transportation took generations to develop. Only master brewers knew the precise combination of temperature, timing, and ingredients. Revealing the formula to an outsider was the equivalent of treason against the guild. But the guilds were more than cartels protecting their economic position. They were also, in many ways, the most effective social welfare system that existed in medieval Europe. Guild members paid regular dues. Those dues funded what was essentially a comprehensive insurance policy. If a guild member fell ill, the guild paid for their care. If a member died, the guild provided for their family. If a member fell into debt through no fault of their own, the guild provided loans at reasonable terms. If a member's workshop burned down, the guild helped rebuild it. This was not charity. It was mutual investment. Every member had a stake in every other member's survival and success, because the strength of the network depended on all of its members remaining functional and productive. The guild halls, which still stand in cities across Europe, were the physical centers of this social system. They were meeting places where disputes were resolved, quality standards were enforced, and community bonds were maintained. They were decorated with the symbols of the trade, the compass and square of the stonemasons, the scissors of the tailors, the crossed hammers of the blacksmiths. Each symbol identified the trade. But the placement and combination of symbols also communicated things that only guild members were meant to read. The architecture of guild halls often encoded information about the building techniques of their constructors. Geometric ratios in the proportions of doorways and windows. Mathematical relationships in the spacing of columns. Information that a trained eye could read and that communicated the builder's level of mastery to anyone who knew how to look. The stonemason guilds that built Europe's great cathedrals represent perhaps the most sophisticated version of this system. The construction of a Gothic cathedral, those soaring stone structures with their enormous windows and their seemingly weightless vaulted ceilings, was among the most technically demanding engineering challenges of the medieval world. Getting the mathematics wrong meant the building collapsed. Occasionally, they did collapse. When they stood, they were monuments to the technical knowledge their builders possessed. That knowledge was the property of the guild. Apprentices learned to cut stone accurately and consistently. Journeymen learned to work with different types of stone and to understand how they behaved under pressure. But only masters understood the full geometric system, the complex calculations of thrust and counterthrust, the understanding of how to route the enormous weight of a stone ceiling through a series of arches and flying buttresses to the ground, that made the difference between a building that lasted centuries and one that fell. These master masons traveled from cathedral to cathedral across Europe. They were among the few people in the medieval world with both the skills and the institutional backing to work internationally. And when they arrived at a new building site, in a city they had never visited before, they needed a way to prove immediately to the local master mason that they were who they claimed to be. The solution was recognition signals. Specific ways of holding tools. Particular ways of positioning the body when asking for work. Coded phrases that identified the speaker as a legitimate member of the guild and indicated their level of skill. The secret handshake, as a concept, was not invented by fraternal organizations for dramatic effect. It was invented by medieval tradespeople as a practical solution to an authentication problem. When a genuine master mason arrived at a new site and exchanged the recognition signals with the master already there, several things happened immediately. He was recognized as legitimate. He was trusted with sensitive technical information. He was given access to the quality of work available to masters. He might be offered lodging, meals, and professional credit simply on the basis of those signals. This was the practical value of the guild system's secret knowledge. Not mystical power. Not divine connection. Just the enormously valuable ability to establish instant trusted relationships across enormous distances in a world where verification was otherwise extremely difficult. The guild system also demonstrates something important about what happens when secret societies calcify. In their early centuries, the guilds served genuinely useful functions. They maintained quality standards, protected knowledge, supported their members, and provided social stability. But over time, as they became more established and more powerful, they started using their control over trade knowledge not to protect good work but to protect their own market position. Innovations that came from outside the guild structure were suppressed. A journeyman who developed a significantly faster production method might find his master blocking him from advancement, either stealing the technique outright or simply ensuring the innovator never received master status and therefore never had the platform to spread his idea. The knowledge protection that had originally served quality eventually served only the interests of those who already held power. When the Industrial Revolution arrived, factory owners needed to train workers quickly in highly specific, narrow tasks. The guild model, with its decade-long apprenticeships and holistic knowledge requirements, was completely incompatible with industrial production. Governments across Europe dismantled guild privileges. The restricted knowledge was made public. The secret techniques that had been protected for generations became accessible to anyone. This transition was painful and often violent. Guild members rioted. Machinery was destroyed. But ultimately the guilds lost, because they had stopped serving the function that had justified their power in the first place. The lesson is as relevant today as it was in the 18th century. Any organization that uses information control primarily to protect its own position, rather than to serve a genuine purpose, eventually becomes an obstacle that powerful economic forces will root around or tear down. Germany, 1614. A pamphlet appears in the streets of Kassel. Anonymous. No author named. No publisher identified. Just the text, printed and distributed, making an extraordinary announcement. There is a secret brotherhood. It was founded over a century earlier by a German nobleman named Christian Rosenkreuz, who traveled to the Middle East and North Africa in the 14th century and learned secrets from ancient and Islamic scholars that European civilization had forgotten. Mathematics, medicine, alchemy, mystical philosophy. He brought this knowledge back to Germany and founded a brotherhood to preserve it, the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross. For generations they worked in silence, healing the sick, advising rulers, pursuing knowledge. And now, the pamphlet announced, the time had come. They were ready to reveal themselves. They invited the learned men of Europe to make contact. The response was extraordinary. Within months, intellectuals across Europe were writing public letters, addressing the invisible brothers, praising their wisdom, begging to be admitted. Philosophers composed entire books about Rosicrucian ideas based on the thin details in the pamphlet. Scientists pledged their allegiance to the order. The most brilliant minds of early modern Europe were clamoring to join. There was just one problem. The Rosicrucians never responded. No one could find them. No one could make contact. 2 more pamphlets appeared over the following years, deepening the mystery and making more promises. But no actual Rosicrucians materialized. Because they almost certainly did not exist. Scholars who have studied the original pamphlets carefully, examining the writing style, the theological content, and the historical context, believe they were written by a circle of Protestant intellectuals centered around a German theologian named Johann Valentin Andri. The whole thing appears to have been a sophisticated thought experiment, possibly satirical, designed to promote ideas about religious tolerance, scientific method, and social reform. They created a fictional secret society to see what would happen. What happened was one of the most remarkable social experiments in intellectual history. The response to the Rosicrucian manifestos tells us something profound about human psychology and about the power of the idea of secret knowledge. These were not credulous peasants responding to the pamphlets. The people who wrote passionate letters to the Invisible Brothers, who founded organizations in the Rosicrucian name, who developed entire philosophical systems based on a fictional brotherhood, these were among the most educated and sophisticated people in early modern Europe. What they were responding to was not evidence. There was no evidence. They were responding to a story. A story about hidden wisdom. About knowledge that had been lost and could be recovered. About a brotherhood that had been quietly working to improve the world, unseen and unrecognized, for generations. That story activated something deep in the human imagination. The hope that there are people out there who know things we do not know. That if we could only find them and gain admission to their circle, everything would become clearer. Here is the remarkable twist in the story. Even though the original Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross almost certainly never existed, genuine Rosicrucian organizations formed across Europe over the following century. They created elaborate initiation rituals, degree systems, libraries. They built real organizations based entirely on a fiction. And those organizations had real effects. Isaac Newton, one of the most important scientists in history, filled his private notebooks with alchemical symbols and references to Rosicrucian ideas. He was not publishing these notes. This was his private intellectual life. The same mind that formulated the laws of motion and invented calculus was deeply engaged with a tradition that traced its origins to a pamphlet that its own authors may have written as a prank. Robert Boyle, who is credited with founding modern chemistry, corresponded with people who claimed Rosicrucian knowledge. The Royal Society in London, which became the institutional home of British science for centuries, had founders with documented Rosicrucian connections. A group called the Invisible College, which was one of the direct precursors to the Royal Society, was called Rosicrucian by some contemporaries precisely because its members worked in semi-secrecy, sharing knowledge outside the traditional university and church structures. The fictional Rosicrucians helped create real science. Not by teaching alchemy, which did not work, but by providing a cultural framework within which educated people could form networks outside official structures, could share heterodox ideas safely, and could build communities of inquiry that eventually produced the scientific revolution. The Rosicrucian story raises a genuinely strange philosophical question. If a secret society that never existed had real historical effects, does it matter whether it was real? Can an idea be more powerful than the organization behind it? Tell us what you think below. The Rosicrucian episode reveals something important about secret societies that the more dramatic stories of Templars and mystery cults can obscure. The power of a secret society is not always in its actual members or its actual activities. Sometimes the power is in the belief that it exists. When people believe that somewhere, out there, there is a group of people who know more than they do, who have access to hidden knowledge, who are quietly working toward some important goal, that belief changes behavior. People organize around the perceived organization. They coordinate their own activities to be compatible with what they imagine the hidden brotherhood is doing. They advocate for ideas they think the organization would approve of. A fictional secret society, believed in strongly enough, can shape intellectual history just as effectively as a real one. And sometimes more effectively, because a fictional organization never has the internal conflicts, the corrupt members, or the disappointing ordinariness that eventually deflates every real institution. The Rosicrucians were not the last organization to discover this. They were not even the most dramatic example. That distinction belongs to an organization we will meet shortly. An organization that existed for just 11 years, accomplished almost nothing, and then became the most feared secret society in history entirely through the power of what people believed about it. But that is a story for the next part of our journey, that we have covered a vast amount of ground in this section. Ancient Egyptian temples, Greek mystery cults, the underground church, warrior monks who invented banking, medieval trade guilds, a fictional brotherhood that shaped real science. What runs through all of it? What is the thread? In every case, the hidden structure served a function. Sometimes it was protecting genuinely valuable technical knowledge. Sometimes it was providing a safe space for ideas that official society would punish. Sometimes it was creating networks of trust that allowed people to coordinate across enormous distances. Sometimes it was maintaining the social bonds that kept communities together under pressure. And in every case, the moment the hidden structure stopped serving a genuine function, it either evolved or it collapsed. The mystery cults became establishment religion and lost their edge. The Templars became so visible that they became a target. The guilds became protectionist cartels and got swept away by industrialization. The organizations that survived were the ones that kept finding new functions, that kept offering something genuinely valuable that people could not get elsewhere, that adapted to changing conditions while maintaining the core of what made them worth belonging to. This is as true of institutions today as it was in ancient Egypt. The form changes. The function is always the same. Shared knowledge, shared commitment, shared identity, and the power that comes from all three. Of everything we have covered so far, which secret society do you find most fascinating? The Egyptian priests who turned astronomy into divine power? The Greek mystery cults that kept their secret for 1,000 years? The early Christians who survived Rome? The Templars who invented banking? Or the Rosicrucians who were never there? Let us know in the comments, and tell us why. Your answer might end up shaping what we cover next. The age when secret societies stopped being underground communities and started actively trying to change the world. We will look at the Freemasons and the role they played in the American and French revolutions. We will meet the real Bavarian Illuminati, and you will discover that the truth about them is both more interesting and more disappointing than the legend. And we will begin to see how the secret society model transformed into something that would survive into the modern world. The game is getting bigger. The stakes are getting higher. There is a building in New Haven, Connecticut that has no windows. It sits on the Yale University campus, surrounded by one of the most prestigious academic institutions in the world. Students walk past it every day. Professors hold classes 50 yards from its walls. Tourists photograph it. And almost no one knows what happens inside it. The building is called the Tomb. It belongs to a secret society called Skull and Bones. And in its windowless rooms, some of the most powerful people in American history have gone through rituals so private that members who have become presidents, senators, Supreme Court justices, and CIA directors have refused to describe them in any detail even decades after leaving office. 3 American presidents have come out of that building. Dozens of senators. Multiple secretaries of state. The people who shaped the 20th century in ways that affected every human being on Earth. And the price of membership was a secret so complete that almost none of them have ever broken it. But here is the thing. Skull and Bones is not the most powerful secret organization that has ever operated in the modern world. It is not even close. To find the ones that really changed history, we have to go back to the 18th century. To candlelit rooms in European cities. To a revolution in human thinking that turned secret societies from underground communities into active forces trying to reshape civilization itself. To the age of the Enlightenment. And the men who decided that the best way to change the world was to do it in the dark. London, 1717. Four men walk into a pub called the Goose and Gridiron Alehouse near St. Paul's Cathedral. They represent four small clubs, lodges, that have been meeting in London for some years. And they are about to make a decision that will ripple through history for the next 3 centuries. They vote to form the Grand Lodge of England, the first formal governing body of what we now call modern Freemasonry. None of these four men are stonemasons. They are merchants, scholars, gentlemen, educated professionals who have borrowed the symbols, the language, and the organizational structure of the medieval stonemason guilds for purposes that have absolutely nothing to do with building cathedrals. What they are building, though they do not fully know it yet, is something far more consequential. A network that will help spark 2 of the most important revolutions in human history, spread Enlightenment philosophy across 3 continents, and create an organizational template that intelligence agencies, political movements, and elite institutions will still be using 300 years later. It starts, like most things that change the world, with a simple idea. What if there was a space where a duke and a shopkeeper could sit at the same table as equals? In 1717 Europe, that idea was genuinely radical. Society was organized around rigid hierarchy. The aristocracy held power by birth. The church held power by divine sanction. Merchants and tradespeople, however wealthy they became, occupied a social tier that prevented them from interacting freely with nobles. Speaking directly and informally to someone far above or far below your station was socially dangerous. The rules governing who could sit where, who spoke first, who showed deference to whom, these were not suggestions. They were the structural code of the entire social system. Inside a Masonic lodge, those rules were suspended. Every man who entered, regardless of his title or his trade, began as an entered apprentice. The same degree. The same starting point. Dukes and merchants went through the same initiation. They wore the same plain aprons that symbolized the equality of all craftsmen before their work. They advanced through the same 3 degrees, entered apprentice, fellow craft, master mason. And they swore the same oaths. For men who spent their daily lives in a world of constant social performance, where every interaction required careful calibration of who you were in relation to who you were talking to, this was extraordinary. For a few hours each week, they could speak freely, debate ideas, form genuine friendships across class lines that the outside world would never have permitted. The rituals served a purpose beyond ceremony. Initiation began with the candidate blindfolded, symbolizing ignorance. He was led through darkness before being brought into light, symbolizing the movement from ignorance to knowledge. He learned that the rough stone represented the unrefined human being, full of potential but shaped by nothing yet. The perfectly cut ashlar represented the human being who had worked on himself, who had used reason and virtue as tools to shape his character. The working tools of the stonemason, the square, the compass, the level, became symbols of ethical principles. The square for honesty and fair dealing. The compass for keeping your passions and behavior within proper bounds. The level for the equality of all human beings before truth and death. These were not just theatrical props. They were memory systems. Ways of encoding ethical principles and physical symbols so that the ideas stayed present and active in the minds of members throughout their daily lives. The recognition signs had a more immediately practical function. In the 18th century, formal institutions for establishing trust were limited. Banks were in their infancy. Credit systems were informal. When a stranger arrived in your city, you had almost no way to verify who they were or whether they could be trusted. References could be forged. Reputations did not travel easily without the internet or telephone. A Freemason arriving in a strange city had a solution. He could seek out the local lodge. Through a specific handshake, a particular way of presenting himself, a series of coded questions and responses, He could establish to any fellow Mason in minutes that he was a genuine member of the fraternity and what his degree of advancement was. Once established, the local network opened to him. Fellow Masons might offer lodging, meals, business contacts, professional credit, letters of introduction. The network functioned as an authentication system for trust, allowing people who had never met to extend to each other the kind of confidence that normally required years of relationship building. A Freemason traveling from London to Philadelphia in 1750, which was a genuinely dangerous journey of weeks or months, would find a network of trusted contacts waiting for him when he arrived. A network he had never met but could rely on almost immediately. This practical value was enormous. And it explains why Freemasonry spread so rapidly across such vastly different cultures and contexts. But Freemasonry spread differently in different places. And those differences matter enormously. In England, it remained relatively conservative. A social club with philosophical undertones. Charitable work. Networking. The rituals preserved and enjoyed as tradition. The politics kept moderate. The English lodges became comfortable homes for professional men who wanted brotherhood and mutual aid without too much controversy. In Germany, it turned philosophical. The lodges filled with intellectuals who used the protected space to explore metaphysics, German idealism, and ideas about the nature of consciousness and freedom. Lodge meetings in German cities could sound more like graduate seminars than fraternal gatherings. In France, it became something much more explosive. French Freemasonry in the decades before 1789 was genuinely politically radical. The lodges filled with philosophers, writers, lawyers, and progressive nobles who used them as the one space available where they could debate ideas that the royal censors would otherwise suppress. Voltaire, the most famous intellectual of the age, was initiated into a Parisian lodge at the age of 83, just weeks before his death. It was a symbolic gesture of solidarity between the lodges and the French Enlightenment. The French police understood what was happening. In 1737, they raided a Parisian lodge and arrested everyone inside. Not for plotting violence. Not for criminal activity. Simply for the offense of men from different social classes treating each other as equals. The ancient regime understood that leveling, the erasure of social distinctions, was itself a revolutionary act. And they were right. If you could have been a member of an 18th century Masonic lodge, which country's version would you have chosen? The philosophical debates of the German lodges? The political fire of the French version? Or the practical networking of the English and American lodges? Tell us in the comments below. In America, Freemasonry was all three at once, and the timing could not have been more significant. By the 1770s, Masonic lodges in the American colonies had become something that the British colonial authorities should have watched far more carefully. They were meeting spaces where men who would become revolutionary leaders gathered regularly, trusted each other absolutely because of their shared oaths, and debated ideas that were becoming increasingly incompatible with continued British rule. The membership list reads like the credits of the American Revolution. George Washington was a Freemason. He had been initiated as a young man in Virginia and maintained his connection to the fraternity throughout his life. When he was inaugurated as the first President of the United States, the Bible on which he swore his oath of office was provided by a New York Masonic lodge. When he laid the cornerstone of the United States Capitol building in 1793, he did it in full Masonic regalia, apron and all, before a crowd of witnesses, performing a Masonic ceremony. This is not disputed or hidden. There are records. The regalia survives in a museum. Benjamin Franklin was a Freemason who helped establish the fraternity in Pennsylvania and served as its Grand Master. He was one of the most influential thinkers of the Revolutionary period, and his Masonic connections extended across the Atlantic to the French lodges whose philosophical networks helped build European support for the American cause. Paul Revere, whose Midnight Ride is perhaps the most famous act of the entire Revolutionary period, was not just a patriot. He was the Grand Master of the Massachusetts Grand Lodge. His intelligence network, the one that made the Midnight Ride possible in the first place, the system of observation posts and couriers that tracked British troop movements throughout Boston, was organized through his Masonic connections. Fellow Masons served as the lookouts in the church towers and the couriers who carried the information. The famous signal, 1 if by land and 2 if by sea, worked because trusted men were positioned throughout the city. Men bound to each other not just by patriotism but by oath. By the kind of trust that comes from shared ritual and mutual commitment that goes deeper than simple political agreement. At least 9 signers of the Declaration of Independence were confirmed Freemasons. Historians suspect the number was probably higher, but records from that era are incomplete. Did Freemasonry cause the American Revolution? No. And this distinction matters enormously, because it is the difference between understanding history and falling into conspiracy thinking. The causes of the American Revolution were real and specific. Taxation without representation. The quartering of soldiers in civilian homes. The restriction of colonial trade for the benefit of British merchants. The accumulated grievance of people who considered themselves British subjects but were being treated as colonial subjects. These were the causes. They existed independently of any secret organization. What Freemasonry provided was infrastructure. Networks of trust that allowed revolutionary organizing to happen more efficiently and more securely than it otherwise would have. Meeting spaces where dangerous ideas could be discussed among people who were bound by oath to protect each other's confidences. A communication system built on personal relationships rather than formal channels that British authorities could monitor. The revolution would have happened without Freemasonry. But Freemasonry made it faster, better coordinated, and harder for the British to disrupt. This is the genuine historical role of secret societies. Not cause. Infrastructure. France is more complicated, and the complications are instructive. By the 1780s, the Parisian Masonic lodges had become the most intellectually vibrant spaces in the country. The ideas of Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu circulated freely behind lodge doors when public discussion of them was legally risky. The concept of social equality, the idea that all human beings possessed natural rights that no king could legitimately override, was debated and refined in lodge meetings by the lawyers, writers, and progressive nobles who would become the leadership class of the French Revolution. The Jacobin Club, which drove the revolution's most radical phase, evolved directly from networks that overlapped significantly with French Freemasonry. Many of its leading members had Masonic backgrounds. The revolution's famous slogan, "Liberty, Equality, Fraternity," was the Masonic motto. The revolutionaries chose it deliberately and explicitly. They knew where it came from. And then the revolution turned on the lodges. As the terror intensified and the revolution became more and more radical, every organization that operated independently of the revolutionary government became suspect. Secret societies were exactly the kind of autonomous network that the Committee of Public Safety feared and hated. Lodges were closed. Masons were arrested. The networks that had helped incubate revolutionary ideas became victims of the revolution they had helped create. This is a pattern that will appear repeatedly throughout this story. Secret societies plant seeds. But they cannot control what grows. The ideas they protect and nurture escape into the world and take on lives of their own, lives that often leave the original organization behind or turn against it entirely. The lodges were kindling. The revolution was the fire. And fire does not take instructions from kindling. Bavaria. May 1, 1776. While American colonists are preparing to declare independence thousands of miles away, a 38-year-old law professor named Adam Weishaupt is sitting with 4 friends in the university town of Ingolstadt. He is frustrated. Deeply, passionately frustrated. The Jesuits control the Bavarian universities. The electoral government suppresses any thinking that challenges religious orthodoxy or questions existing power arrangements. The ideas of the Enlightenment, reason, secularism, individual liberty, the belief that human beings can improve their condition through the application of rational thought rather than through deference to church and crown, these ideas are available in books that circulate underground. But expressing them publicly means professional ruin. Possibly worse. Weishaupt has a plan. If you cannot change the system from outside, you change it from inside. And the way you change it from inside is to quietly place people who share your values into positions where they can influence policy, education, and public opinion. You build a hidden network. A secret society within a secret society. An organization so carefully designed that it can operate right underneath the noses of the authorities without being detected. He calls it the Order of the Illuminati. The Enlightened Ones. 5 members at the founding meeting. 5 men who believe they can change the world. What happened next is one of the most instructive stories in the entire history of secret societies. Because the Bavarian Illuminati is simultaneously one of the most real and one of the most mythologized organizations that has ever existed. The gap between what they actually were and what people believe they were is a gap you could fit an entire civilization into. Weishaupt was a genuine organizational genius in some respects. His recruitment strategy was sophisticated. He did not try to sign up everyone who seemed sympathetic to Enlightenment ideas. He targeted specific people. Educated, influential, well-positioned individuals. Lawyers who would eventually become judges. Writers who shaped public opinion. University professors who educated the next generation of leaders. Minor nobles with access to courts and governments. People who were already positioned to matter. His security architecture was elaborate. Members of the Illuminati were organized in cells. Each member knew only the people in their immediate cell plus one contact in the cell above them. No ordinary member had a complete picture of the organization. Even senior members had only partial information about the full extent of the network. This was exactly the compartmentalization that early Christians had used to survive Roman persecution and that intelligence agencies would use 2 centuries later. Members operated under code names drawn from history and mythology. Weishaupt himself was Spartacus, the leader of the famous slave rebellion against Rome. Cities were given code names. Munich became Athens, Vienna became Rome, Paris became Utica. All correspondence used these code names. No document, if intercepted, would directly identify a real person or place. The rank structure mimicked the mystery cult template with new names: Novice, Minerval, Illuminatus Minor, Illuminatus Major, ascending through higher degrees toward a small inner circle that Weishaupt never fully revealed to most members. Each advancement came with new knowledge and new obligations. Each level required demonstrated loyalty before the next was accessible. And the most brilliant tactical move was this. Weishaupt did not try to build the Illuminati separately from existing institutions. He encouraged his members to join Masonic lodges. Not to replace Freemasonry but to operate within it, to gradually influence Masonic culture in directions favorable to Illuminati goals, and to use the Masons' respectable public profile as cover for the more radical organizing happening underneath. It worked. For a while. Within a decade, the Illuminati had grown to somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 members spread across Bavaria, Austria, and neighboring German states. This is not speculation. Membership lists survive in Bavarian state archives. We know who joined. The Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick, one of the most powerful nobles in German-speaking Europe, was a member. The writer and poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, already famous across Europe, was a member. The philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder was a member. These were not fringe figures or social failures. They were establishment intellectuals who had been persuaded by Weishaupt's vision of a world reshaped by reason and Enlightenment values. The documents that survive reveal an organization obsessed with influence and careful to the point of paranoia about security. Letters discuss strategies for placing sympathetic members in government positions, in universities, in church appointments. Plans describe how to shape public opinion through articles placed in journals under cover names. Organizational charts show the hierarchical structure with information flowing upward but almost never downward. This was real. The Bavarian Illuminati existed. They had genuine political goals. They used genuine infiltration tactics. They had genuine powerful members. But here is where reality diverges sharply from the legend that has grown up around them. Remember the lightning strike of this series? In 1784, a courier carrying Illuminati documents was killed by lightning while riding through the Bavarian countryside. Local authorities collected the scattered papers and began reading them. What they found, the code names, the infiltration plans, the organizational charts, sent immediate shock waves through the Bavarian government. What followed was swift and thorough. The Bavarian government raided Illuminati meeting places. They arrested members. They seized more documents. The Elector, the ruler of Bavaria, issued edicts banning all secret societies. Weishaupt fled across the border and spent the rest of his life in exile, writing books about what he had tried to do. By 1787, the Illuminati were finished. 11 years. That is how long the Order of the Illuminati actively operated. 11 years. A maximum of 2,000 members. And a measurable impact on actual historical events that was, to put it generously, minimal. They published no significant intellectual works. They influenced no major legislation. They changed no government policies. Their great infiltration of Freemasonry achieved little beyond making some Masons suspicious of what might be operating within their own lodges. The organization was a fascinating experiment that failed. And then the French Revolution happened. The French Revolution began in 1789, 2 years after the Illuminati had been shut down. It was one of the most dramatic events in European history. Kings across the continent were terrified. Churches saw their property seized and their authority challenged. The entire established order of European civilization seemed to be collapsing. People desperately needed an explanation. Something had to have caused this. History on this scale could not simply happen. A French Jesuit priest named Augustin Barruel provided one. In a series of books published in the 1790s, he argued that the Illuminati had orchestrated the entire French Revolution. That the apparently spontaneous uprising of the French people was in fact the result of a coordinated conspiracy by this secret organization, working through the Masonic lodges, to destroy Christianity and monarchy. The evidence for this theory was exactly zero. The Illuminati had been disbanded for 2 years before the revolution began. There was no documented connection between the Bavarian organization and the French revolutionary leadership. The actual causes of the French Revolution, the bankruptcy of the French state, the failure of harvests, the staggering inequality between the aristocracy and everyone else, the decades of Enlightenment philosophy undermining the legitimacy of absolute monarchy, were well documented and sufficient to explain everything that happened. None of that mattered. The conspiracy theory was far more satisfying than the complicated truth. It gave terrified conservatives a villain. It explained the inexplicable in terms of human agency rather than systemic forces. It placed the catastrophe inside a framework where it could be understood and, in theory, fought. Barrow's books were bestsellers. They were translated into multiple languages and distributed across Europe. The narrative they created, the all-powerful Illuminati secretly controlling events from behind the scenes, took on a life completely independent of the actual historical facts. And here is the most remarkable part of the Illuminati story. The myth grew. With every decade, with every new political upheaval, with every development that frightened people who had something to lose, the Illuminati were blamed. The 19th century blamed them for revolutionary movements across Europe. The 20th century blamed them for communism, for international banking, for the two world wars, for the United Nations. The 21st century has seen the Illuminati accused of controlling the entertainment industry, embedding symbols in music videos, orchestrating pandemic responses, and managing a global depopulation agenda. A secret society that existed for 11 years and accomplished almost nothing has become the eternal scapegoat of conspiracy culture. The explanation for everything that frightens people. The villain behind every mystery. Why? What does the story of the Illuminati tell us about the psychology of conspiracy thinking? It tells us that conspiracy theories are not primarily about truth. They are about comfort. The real causes of the French Revolution were complex, systemic, and would require pages of nuanced historical analysis to explain. The conspiracy version takes 30 seconds. A secret group of bad people planned it. Everything makes sense. There is a villain. There is a plot. The terrifying unpredictability of historical forces becomes, in the conspiracy version, a deliberate and targeted attack that can in theory be identified and stopped. This psychological comfort is so powerful that no amount of contradictory evidence seems to significantly reduce the appeal of the theory. When confronted with the fact that the Illuminati disbanded before the French Revolution, conspiracy believers respond that this is exactly what you would expect a secret society powerful enough to survive 2 centuries to want you to think. When confronted with the complete absence of evidence connecting the historical Illuminati to any modern organization, they respond that a truly powerful secret society would of course destroy the evidence. The theory is designed to be unfalsifiable. And an unfalsifiable theory, one where no evidence could possibly disprove it, is not a theory at all. It is a religion. The Bavarian Illuminati existed for only 11 years and arguably accomplished very little. Yet they have become the most famous secret society in history, blamed for events happening centuries after they dissolved. What do you think this tells us about human psychology? Why do we need conspiracy theories? Give us your honest answer in the comments. Naples, 1807. Napoleon's armies have occupied the city and the surrounding region. The French are efficient administrators. They have brought modern legal codes, improved infrastructure, cleared out the most corrupt elements of the old aristocratic administration. But they are also foreign occupiers, and the people of southern Italy have not asked for this particular version of improvement. In basement rooms. In forest clearings. In the backs of shops after closing time. Men have begun to meet. They call themselves the Carbonari. The charcoal burners. The name is deliberate camouflage. In southern Italy, charcoal burning is a humble trade. Groups of men meeting to talk about charcoal production is unremarkable. Groups of men meeting to discuss revolution is a hanging offense. So they adopt the language of the trade as code. Recruiting new members is called selling coal. Fellow members are called good cousins. Italy itself is referred to as the forest. An entire revolutionary vocabulary is hidden in the language of a mundane profession. Their initiation is borrowed heavily from Freemasonry but adapted to Italian flavor. Candidates are blindfolded and led through symbolic trials representing the struggles of the patriot against tyranny. They swear loyalty oaths that are literal in their consequences. Betray the society, and brothers will find you. The organization's justice is not metaphorical. The structure is cellular in the same way that every resilient underground organization has always been. Small groups, called vendite, which means sales outlets, operate independently. Each vendita knows only its own members and perhaps one contact in another cell. You cannot betray the whole network because you genuinely do not know the whole network. You can only betray what you know, which is a small piece, deliberately kept small. The Carbonari spread with remarkable speed. What started as a local resistance movement in southern Italy under French occupation quickly evolved into something much larger. As word spread and the organizational model proved effective, Carbonari cells appeared across all the Italian states. Then in France. Then in Spain and Portugal. Then in Poland. Wherever authoritarian governments suppressed political organizing, wherever constitutions were revoked and rights withdrawn, wherever people who wanted a say in their own governance had no legal avenue to pursue it, Carbonari cells appeared. They were a franchise model for revolution, adapting to local conditions while maintaining the core structure. The coded language evolved too. New phrases were added as the network expanded. Specific signals for recognizing a fellow member in a crowd. Ways of asking questions that sounded innocent but were actually requests for identification. An entire parallel communication system running underneath ordinary social interaction that only initiates could decode. When Austrian police in 1821 finally managed to significantly infiltrate the Italian Carbonari, what they discovered terrified the Habsburg authorities. The organization was not planning one revolution. They were planning dozens of them simultaneously. Coordinated uprisings timed to overwhelm the limited forces available to any single government by requiring those governments to suppress multiple crises at the same time. It was genuinely sophisticated strategic thinking. And for a moment, it seemed like it might work. The Carbonari uprisings of the 1820s followed a pattern that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. In Naples in 1820, Carbonari members within the military organized officers sympathetic to constitutional government. They marched on the capital. King Ferdinand, faced with an organized military revolt, capitulated. He swore to uphold the constitution. The revolution seemed to have succeeded. It lasted 1 year. Austria, deeply threatened by the idea of constitutional government spreading to its Italian territories, sent in troops. The Neapolitan army, poorly led and undermined by loyalist officers, collapsed. The constitution was revoked. The leaders of the uprising were arrested, exiled, or executed. Ferdinand, safely restored by Austrian bayonets, pretended his oath to the constitution had been made under duress and therefore did not count. The same pattern repeated in Piedmont in 1821. Initial military uprising. Brief constitutional government. Austrian military intervention. Collapse. Arrests. Executions. Exile. Measured by immediate outcomes, the Carbonari uprisings were failures. The revolutionary governments they created survived for months, not years. The constitutions they won were revoked as soon as foreign troops arrived. And yet, the Carbonari kept fighting for decades even though most of their uprisings ended in failure and many of their members were executed. Is that kind of commitment admirable, or does there come a point where persistence becomes stubbornness? When do you think a movement should change its strategy? Tell us what you think below. Here is what the Carbonari actually accomplished, and it is more important than any single uprising. They maintained revolutionary pressure across 4 decades. Every failed uprising proved that the desire for constitutional government was real and persistent. Every execution created a martyr who inspired the next generation. Every government crackdown demonstrated to educated Europeans across the continent that the old order was willing to use extreme violence to maintain itself, which further delegitimized that order in the eyes of people who might otherwise have stayed neutral. The Carbonari were not kindling. They were a slow-burning coal, which is appropriate given their name. They did not produce a dramatic explosion. They maintained sustained heat that eventually, through decades of consistent pressure, changed the conditions that made the old order possible. The individuals who grew up in the Carbonari network, who were shaped by its culture of commitment and sacrifice, who built their identities around the goal of Italian unification and constitutional government, these individuals eventually became the leadership class of the Risorgimento, the movement that unified Italy in the 1860s. Giuseppe Mazzini, the intellectual who became the spiritual voice of Italian nationalism, was a Carbonaro. His writings on nationhood, on the right of peoples to self-determination, on the moral obligation to fight for freedom, these ideas circulated through Carbonari networks before they reached wider audiences. The Carbonari were Mazzini's first real political community. They shaped him, and he became one of the people who shaped modern Italy. Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of the emperor who would eventually become Napoleon III of France, joined the Carbonari during his years of exile as a young man. His early revolutionary experiences, living underground, dependent on the loyalty of fellow conspirators, committed to a cause that required personal sacrifice, these formed his political character. When he eventually held power, they shaped how he used it. The Carbonari prove a principle that runs throughout the history of secret societies. You do not measure their influence only in their victories. You measure it in the people they shaped, the ideas they kept alive, and the groundwork they laid for changes that came long after the original organization had dissolved. London, 1888. Three men sit in a study surrounded by books. William Woodman, a coroner. William Wynne Westcott, a doctor who serves as a London coroner and is also a dedicated occultist. Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathis, a museum curator with an obsessive interest in medieval magic and Kabbalah. They claim to have discovered a set of encrypted manuscripts containing the secrets of a German occult order. They decode the manuscripts. They use the decoded content to found a new organization. They call it the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. The manuscripts were almost certainly fabricated. Historians have traced their likely origins to Westcott himself. The German order they supposedly came from appears not to have existed. None of this prevented what happened next from being genuinely significant. Within a decade, the Golden Dawn had attracted a membership that reads like a who's who of late Victorian intellectual and artistic culture. William Butler Yeats, who would win the Nobel Prize for Literature, was deeply involved for years. His poetry is saturated with Golden Dawn symbolism. The Jais, the system of historical cycles that structures his most important work. The phases of the moon. The mystical geometry that appears throughout his verse. All of this comes directly from his Golden Dawn training. Florence Farr, one of the most acclaimed actresses on the Victorian stage, who was also a close friend of George Bernard Shaw and a significant cultural figure in her own right, served as a senior officer of the order and eventually became its head in Britain. Arthur Machen, whose horror fiction influenced H.P. Lovecraft and shaped a century of weird fiction writing, was a committed member who drew directly on Golden Dawn ideas in his most famous works. Arthur Edward Waite designed the Rider-Waite Tarot deck, still by far the most widely used tarot deck in the world more than a century later, as a visual encoding of Golden Dawn symbolism. Every card carries the order system of correspondences between the Kabbalah, astrology, alchemy, and elemental magic. And then there was Aleister Crowley. Brilliant, deliberately provocative, morally transgressive in ways that scandalized even a London that had seen quite a lot. He joined the order in 1898 at the age of 23 and immediately began causing problems. His ambition was too naked. His behavior was too extreme. His determination to advance through the degree system faster than the leadership thought appropriate created constant conflict. He was eventually expelled. And then he spent the rest of his life in a complicated relationship with everything the Golden Dawn had taught him, simultaneously claiming to have surpassed it and being unable to stop referencing it. But what were these educated, sophisticated, successful people actually doing in their temple rooms? The rituals were elaborate. Initiations involved blindfolding, symbolic journeys through elemental realms, oath-taking before decorated altars, the donning of colored robes that indicated rank and elemental affiliation. Members learned an interlocking system of symbolic correspondences that linked the 10 spheres of the Kabbalistic tree of life to the planets, the elements, the tarot cards, the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, specific angelic names, specific plants, metals, and colors. The practical work involved what they called magic. Ritual invocations of angelic forces. Banishing ceremonies that were supposed to clear a space of unwanted influences. Path workings, which were guided meditations in which the meditator would imaginatively travel through the landscape of the tree of life, encountering symbolic figures and collecting experiences that were supposed to develop specific aspects of consciousness. They kept detailed magical diaries. Records of their experiments, their visions, their experiences, their assessments of what worked and what did not. The scientific method applied to subjective experience. Did any of it work in the literal sense? Did invoking the angel Michael actually summon a supernatural being? Did the rituals actually do what the system said they did? That question is impossible to answer definitively. What we can say is that the members of the Golden Dawn reported experiences that they found genuinely transformative. The intensive use of symbol and ritual appears to have produced real changes in how they thought and felt and created. Whether those changes were caused by contact with genuinely supernatural forces or by the extraordinary power of the human mind when subjected to focused, systematic symbolic work is a question that remains open. What is not open is the Golden Dawn's influence on modern Western culture. Carl Jung, the psychiatrist whose ideas about the unconscious mind have been enormously influential in psychology, psychotherapy, and cultural theory, was deeply familiar with Western occultism including the Golden Dawn tradition. His concepts of archetypes, the idea that the human unconscious contains universal symbolic patterns, and the collective unconscious, the idea that these patterns are shared across humanity, draw heavily on the same symbolic systems that the Golden Dawn was working with. Jung explicitly engaged with alchemy and Hermetic philosophy in his later work. The entire modern Western occult revival, everything from Wicca to chaos magic to various neo-pagan traditions, traces its intellectual lineage back to Golden Dawn innovations. The system of magical training they developed, the way they synthesized Kabbalah, astrology, tarot, and ceremonial magic into a coherent system with a logical internal structure, became the template for virtually every Western magical tradition that came after. And the order's influence on literature extends well beyond Yeats. The atmosphere of occult mystery, the idea of hidden knowledge accessible only through initiation, the world where symbols carry genuine power and where the surface of reality conceals deeper truths accessible to those who know how to look, all of this runs through a significant strand of 20th century literature, film, and popular culture. The Golden Dawn also demonstrates something important about how secret societies end. The order lasted in its original form from 1888 to approximately 1903, about 15 years. It ended not through external suppression but through internal conflict. Personality clashes. Power struggles. Disputes over whether the mysterious German contacts whose authority supposedly legitimized the whole enterprise actually existed. Crowley's provocations. Matthys' increasingly erratic demands for absolute obedience from London while he lived in Paris and claimed to receive instructions from supernatural secret chiefs. When the original order fractured into competing successor groups, something interesting happened. The fragmentation spread the teaching more widely than a unified organization would have. Each splinter group took Golden Dawn material to new audiences. Members who left the order published books that made the previously secret knowledge available to anyone who wanted it. The secret society destroyed itself and in doing so democratized its secrets. Which, in retrospect, may have been the most significant thing it ever did. A man failed an exam. He had a vision. He started a movement. Within 5 years, he controlled a third of China and had launched a war that would kill between 20 and 30 million people. If you have never heard of Hong Xiuquan, that fact alone should tell you something about whose history gets remembered and whose gets forgotten. Hong Xiuquan took the Chinese Imperial Civil Service examination 4 times. 4 times he failed. In the China of the 1830s and 1840s, this was not a minor setback. The examination system was the only legitimate pathway to government office, to social status, to the kind of respect that education and intelligence deserved. Failing it repeatedly meant being permanently locked out of the world that your abilities qualified you to enter. After his third failure, Hong collapsed with a high fever. For 40 days he lay unconscious, experiencing visions. An old man with a golden beard who commanded him to destroy demons. A middle-aged man who taught him how to fight the forces of evil. When Hong recovered, he could not fully explain what he had experienced. Not until years later, when he came across Christian missionary pamphlets that had been distributed in the coastal cities, did the framework click into place. The old man was God the Father. The middle-aged man was Jesus Christ. And Hong himself, in this interpretation, was the younger brother of Jesus, sent to establish God's kingdom on earth. This sounds, from the outside, like a man with a serious mental illness constructing an elaborate delusional system. The Qing imperial government certainly thought so. They dismissed Hong and his growing movement as a cult of lunatics. They were wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Hong's message resonated with people who had very specific and legitimate reasons to be angry. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled China since 1644, was visibly struggling. The Opium Wars had exposed the military weakness of the empire and resulted in humiliating treaties with Western powers. The government was increasingly corrupt. Taxation was crushing poor farmers who had little to show for it except poverty and debt. Ethnic minorities, including the Hakka people from whom Hong himself came, faced systematic discrimination from the Han Chinese who dominated the official class. These were real grievances. And Hong's message addressed them directly and powerfully. His God-worshipping society blended Christian theology, drawn from the missionary pamphlets, with Chinese millenarian traditions about coming transformations of the world. He promised land redistribution. Gender equality, which in 1840s China was a genuinely radical concept. Prohibition of opium, which was destroying millions of lives. An end to foot binding. Collective ownership of property distributed based on need. This was not a minor religious movement. This was a comprehensive program for social transformation, and it found an audience that the imperial government had created through years of misgovernment. Followers grew from dozens to hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands. In 1851, Hong declared himself the heavenly king of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, the Kingdom of Great Peace. What had been an underground religious movement became an open revolutionary force. Hong Xiuquan built a revolutionary movement that nearly toppled the dynasty, starting from a vision he had during a fever. Do you think the religious element of the Taiping movement was genuinely believed by its followers, or was it primarily political packaging for economic grievances? This is a debate historians still argue about. Give us your take in the comments. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was one of the most remarkable political entities of the 19th century, and almost no one in the Western world knows it existed. At its peak, the Taiping government controlled territory containing approximately 30 million people. They captured and held Nanjing, one of the greatest cities in China, for over a decade, renaming it Heavenly Capital. They fielded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. They defeated Qing imperial forces repeatedly and brilliantly, using a combination of conventional military tactics, guerrilla operations, and the ferocious commitment that comes from people fighting for beliefs they genuinely hold. The Taiping social experiment was astonishing in its radicalism. Women served in combat roles and as administrators, this in a society where women were expected to remain in domestic seclusion with bound feet. Land was held collectively and distributed according to family need, a vision of communal agriculture that would not appear again at scale until the 20th century. Education was reorganized around the new religious texts. The traditional examination system, that same system whose failure had set Hong on this path, was abolished. For over a decade, this alternative civilization operated in the heart of China. And then it collapsed. The Qing dynasty received crucial military assistance from European powers, particularly Britain, who were deeply alarmed by the disruption the Taiping movement was causing to the trade relationships they had so recently and painfully established. Western-led forces, most famously the ever-victorious army commanded by the American Frederick Townsend Ward and later the British officer Charles Gordon, helped stabilize the imperial military position. Internal divisions within the Taiping leadership proved fatal. Hong's visions grew increasingly erratic. His demands became more extreme and less connected to practical governance. His senior generals began fighting each other. The coherent military strategy of the early years gave way to internal fragmentation. By 1864, Qing forces had recaptured Nanjing. Hong Xiuquan died in the final days, possibly by suicide, possibly by poison, possibly from starvation and illness. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom collapsed. Between 20 and 30 million people died in this conflict. More than the American Civil War, the Napoleonic Wars, and the Crimean War combined. It was arguably the deadliest conflict of the entire 19th century. And it started with a man who failed an exam and had a vision. January 1917. British intelligence intercepts a telegram. It has been sent by Arthur Zimmermann, the German foreign minister, to the German ambassador in Mexico. Its contents are explosive. Germany is about to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. This will likely bring the United States into the war against Germany. Therefore, Zimmermann proposes, Germany should offer Mexico a military alliance. If Mexico attacks the United States from the south, it can recover Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. British intelligence decodes the telegram, confirms its authenticity, and leaks it to the American press. The American public, which had been deeply resistant to involvement in a European war, erupts in outrage. Within months, the United States declares war on Germany. The addition of American forces tilts the balance of the war decisively. One decoded telegram changed the course of world history. That is when the major powers of the 20th century finally understood fully and completely something that the Knights Templar had known in the 12th century and that the Carbonari had practiced in the 19th. Information is power. Sometimes information is more powerful than armies. And the organizations built to gather, protect, and use information, the intelligence agencies that emerged as major institutions of the 20th century, are secret societies in every meaningful sense of the term. Just secret societies with government budgets, legal authority, and technologies that historical brotherhoods could never have imagined. The parallels between intelligence agencies and historical secret societies are not superficial. They are structural, fundamental. The same principles rediscovered through the same operational necessities. Recruitment. Every major intelligence agency discovered what secret societies had known for centuries. Ideological commitment creates more reliable agents than money. People who believe in a cause maintain their cover under pressure better than mercenaries who are just being paid. Soviet intelligence recruited at Cambridge and Oxford by offering brilliant, idealistic young men a vision of a better world through communism. American intelligence recruited from Yale and Harvard by appealing to patriotism and the sense of being part of an elite effort to protect civilization. In both cases, what they were looking for was the same thing that mystery cults and Masonic lodges had always looked for. People whose commitment went deeper than self-interest. Compartmentalization. Operatives knew only what they needed to know. Information flowed upward in the hierarchy but almost never downward. Each agent had a handler they reported to but limited knowledge of other agents their handler was running. If captured and tortured, an agent could only reveal what they knew, which was by design a limited slice of the overall operation. The Carbonari had operated on exactly this principle. Intelligence agencies refined it with 20th-century bureaucratic precision. Progressive degrees of access. Security clearances created a hierarchy of information access that mapped almost exactly onto the degree systems of mystery cults and Masonic lodges. Confidential. Secret. Top secret. Sensitive compartmented information. Each level revealed more. Each level required deeper vetting, stronger demonstrated loyalty, and acceptance of more severe consequences for betrayal. Ritual and identity. Intelligence officers swore secrecy oaths as binding as any Templar or Illuminati member had ever sworn. The culture of intelligence agencies developed its own rituals, its own language, its own identity markers that distinguished insiders from outsiders. The sense of belonging to an elite brotherhood with access to knowledge that ordinary citizens could not have was carefully cultivated because it was operationally valuable. People who felt they belonged to something special, something important, something secret, were more committed and more careful than people who thought of themselves as just doing a job. The story of Kim Philby is perhaps the most dramatic illustration of how completely intelligence agencies had absorbed the organizational lessons of historical secret societies. Philby was one of British intelligence's most brilliant and successful officers. He rose through the ranks of MI6 to become one of its senior figures. He was charming, competent, and trusted absolutely. He was exactly the kind of person that the organization had been designed to recruit and retain. He was also a Soviet spy. Had been from the beginning. Philby had been recruited at Cambridge University in the early 1930s by Soviet intelligence handlers who recognized something in him. Ideological commitment to a cause, communism, that he genuinely believed represented humanity's best path forward. A willingness to take on a secret identity and maintain it indefinitely. And the social skills and intelligence to operate successfully in exactly the environment where he would be most useful. For 30 years, Philby passed British intelligence secrets to the Soviets. He rose to become the head of the MI6 section responsible for operations against the Soviet Union. He was essentially running a section of British intelligence on behalf of the organization that British intelligence was trying to fight. He was eventually exposed, not through any failure of tradecraft on his part, but because a Soviet defector provided information that pointed toward him. He escaped to Moscow in 1963, where he lived until his death in 1988. Philby was one of 5 Cambridge students, the Cambridge Five, who were recruited by Soviet intelligence in the 1930s and maintained their cover for decades. They were motivated by ideology. They maintained their security through compartmentalization. They were, in every meaningful sense, a secret society operating within the British state. The full extent of what intelligence agencies accomplished through their secret operations during the 20th century is still not fully known. Some of it has been declassified. Some of it will remain classified for generations. Some of it may never be made public. What we know is extraordinary enough. The CIA's Operation Ajax in 1953 overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized the Iranian oil industry. This was done through a network of paid agents, sympathetic military officers, and organized street protests that were made to look spontaneous. The people of Iran saw a popular uprising. The reality was a carefully planned operation by hidden hands. The consequences of that intervention are still playing out today. The KGB placed agents throughout Western governments. They influenced elections, ran disinformation campaigns, recruited journalists and academics who published content shaped by Soviet interests. They operated on a scale and with a sophistication that would have astonished even the most ambitious leaders of the Bavarian Illuminati. The extraordinary irony of the 20th century is this. Governments that historically suppressed secret societies, that banned them, that arrested their members and confiscated their property, because they represented autonomous organization outside state control, these same governments created their own secret societies with budgets, legal protections, and operational capabilities that no historical brotherhood had ever approached. They turned the secret society model into a department of government. They put it in headquarters buildings with pension plans and congressional oversight. They gave it everything except the robes. Back to that windowless building in New Haven. Skull and Bones was founded at Yale University in 1832. Since then, it has tapped 15 seniors each year to join its membership. That is 15 people per year, every year, for nearly 2 centuries. Do the math and you get a network of thousands of members spanning multiple generations. But it is not the number that matters. It is the selection. The process, called tapping, happens each spring. Senior members identify the 15 juniors they consider most likely to become genuinely powerful and influential. They evaluate leadership records, achievement, social skills, and family connections. If your father was a bonesman, your chances improve significantly. The network reproduces itself partly on merit and partly on inheritance, which is exactly how aristocracies have always worked. Those selected gain access to the tomb, the windowless building, for the remainder of their time at Yale. What happens inside has been described, in fragments, by various people who felt the oath did not extend beyond death or who believed the secrecy had become a form of institutional dishonesty. Initiation reportedly involves lying in a coffin and recounting your complete sexual history to the assembled membership. This is not hazing in the ordinary sense. It is a vulnerability ritual, the same psychological mechanism that mystery cults and intelligence agencies and every effective secret organization has used to create genuine trust bonds. When you have shared your most private self with a group of people, those people are no longer strangers. The vulnerability creates intimacy that ordinary socializing takes years to build. Regular meetings throughout senior year involve philosophical discussions, rituals that blend the serious and the deliberately absurd, and the gradual construction of relationships that members are expected to maintain and honor for the rest of their lives. The membership list is not secret. It is a matter of historical record. William Howard Taft, 27th President of the United States. George Herbert Walker Bush, 41st President. George Walker Bush, 43rd President. These are the confirmed presidential members. There are rumors about others. Multiple secretaries of state. Multiple CIA directors. Supreme Court justices. Senators and representatives. Generals. Investment bankers. Media executives. Publishing figures. The network spans the entire structure of American elite power. Does Skull and Bones control America? That is the conspiracy version of the story, and it is wrong. Here is the accurate version. Skull and Bones is a networking organization for people who were statistically likely to become powerful whether they joined or not. Yale University selects ambitious, talented, well-connected students. Skull and Bones selects the most promising among that already selected group. Many members would have reached positions of influence through their own abilities and existing connections even without the society. But membership helps. The mechanism is self-reinforcing and operates through entirely normal human psychology. A bonesman running a major investment bank thinks of fellow bonesmen as known quantities, as people who share certain values and a certain background, as people who can be trusted in ways that are hard to articulate but easy to act on. A bonesman senator gives weight to the recommendation letter of another bonesman. A bonesman partner at a law firm notices when a resume includes Yale graduation and certain activities. None of this requires conspiracy. It requires only the normal human tendency to trust and favor people who belong to the same community, amplified by the bonds created by shared secret experience, multiplied across 2 centuries and thousands of members. The result is a network that has genuine, documented influence on how power operates in America. Not control. Influence. The difference matters. Would you want your child to be tapped by Skull and Bones if they attended Yale? Does the networking advantage outweigh the ethical concerns about secret societies that perpetuate inequality? This is a question that does not have an easy answer. Tell us where you stand in the comments. We have moved from the candlelit lodges of 18th century Freemasonry to the windowless rooms of Yale Skull and Bones. From the revolutionary cells of the Carbonari to the intelligence agencies that turned secret society principles into government departments. From the mystical ambitions of the Golden Dawn to the apocalyptic violence of the typing heavenly kingdom. What do all these organizations share? They all emerged because there was something important that could not be done openly. Ideas that official society would punish. Coordination that official channels would block. Knowledge that formal institutions would suppress. Trust that ordinary social structures could not build fast enough to be useful. They all used the same basic tools. Initiation that created vulnerability and bonding. Progressive access to information that maintained engagement and rewarded loyalty. Compartmentalization that protected the network from external attack. Symbols and rituals that kept members connected to shared identity even in daily life. And they all eventually faced the same challenge. What do you do when the need for secrecy passes? When the ideas you protected become mainstream? When the coordination you provided can be achieved through open institutions? When the knowledge you guarded becomes widely available? Some dissolved. The Carbonari dissolved when Italian nationalism became a legitimate political movement. The Golden Dawn dissolved when its members published its secrets and made them accessible to anyone. Some transformed. Early Christianity transformed from underground network to institutional church. Freemasonry transformed from radical Enlightenment network to conservative social club. Some calcified. The medieval guilds calcified into protectionist cartels and were swept away by industrial capitalism. And some became so embedded in the structures of power that they stopped being recognizably secret at all. The intelligence agencies, the elite university societies, the policy councils, these operate in plain sight while maintaining the essential functions that have always made secret societies powerful. The form keeps changing. The function never does. In the next section of this series, we are going to look at what happened when secret societies went digital. When the internet arrived, it was supposed to make secrecy impossible. Every communication leaves traces. Every connection can be mapped. Every identity can be found if someone looks hard enough. What actually happened was the opposite. The internet did not kill secret societies. It gave them superpowers. We are going to look at the cypherpunks, a group of mathematicians and programmers who decided that encryption was the most powerful tool for freedom ever invented. We are going to look at what happened when they gave that tool to the world, and what grew in the darkness that the tool created. We are going to look at Anonymous, a collective that has no members, no leadership, no headquarters, and no name, and yet somehow manages to coordinate operations that bring down governments, humiliate corporations, and expose the powerful. And we are going to look at the dark web, the hidden layer of the internet that operates on the same principle that has driven secret societies since the priests of ancient Egypt decided not to share their astronomical calculations. Information asymmetry is power. And the digital age has made it possible to maintain that asymmetry at a scale and with a precision that would have seemed like pure fantasy to the 9 knights who knelt in Jerusalem in 1119. The secret societies of the future are being built right now. And you are already living inside some of them without knowing it. The game behind the game keeps going. And it is getting bigger. Right now, as you watch this, there is a war being fought. Not with guns. Not with armies. Not with bombs. It is being fought with mathematics. And the two sides are not countries or political parties. They are ideas. One side believes that powerful people have the right to know everything about everyone. The other side believes that every human being has the right to keep secrets. To communicate without being monitored. To organize without being observed. To exist without leaving a permanent, searchable, government-accessible record of every thought and every action and every connection. This war started long before the internet existed. It started in temples in ancient Egypt. It continued in underground tunnels beneath Rome. It ran through the lodge rooms of 18th century Europe and the forest clearings of revolutionary Italy. And now it is running through the servers and satellites and fiber optic cables that carry virtually everything that happens in the modern world. The weapons in this war are ones that no medieval knight or Victorian occultist could have imagined. They are algorithms. Encryption protocols. Anonymous networks that route communication through dozens of countries simultaneously, making any single point of interception useless. Digital currencies that allow value to move across the planet without any bank, any government, any institution of any kind being able to stop it or even see it. And in October 2008, someone fired what may be the most significant shot in this war's entire history. They published a 9-page document. They signed it with a name that no one had ever heard. And then, after the system that document described went live and began to change the world, they disappeared completely. Leaving behind a mystery that the combined intelligence resources of every major government on Earth have been unable to solve. Their name was Satoshi Nakamoto. Their creation was Bitcoin. And the story of who they were and why they vanished is the perfect entry point into the final and most consequential chapter of the entire history of secret societies. Because what Satoshi Nakamoto did was something that every secret society in the previous 3,000 years had attempted and none had ever fully achieved. They built a system that made their own identity irrelevant. That continued to operate, grow, and transform the world long after they removed themselves from it. That required no trust in any individual, because trust was built into the mathematics itself. The game behind the game had gone digital. And it would never be the same again. To understand where we are going, you need to understand where this started. San Francisco Bay Area. 1992. Three people in an office surrounded by computers and the particular smell of electronics that defined the early Internet era. Eric Hughes. Mathematician. Timothy C. May. Former senior scientist at Intel who had retired at 34 after his stock options made him wealthy enough to spend the rest of his life thinking. John Gilmore. Software engineer. Early Sun Microsystems employee. Person who once said that the Internet interprets censorship as damage and roots around it, which became one of the defining statements of the entire digital rights movement. They were starting a mailing list. The list would be called the cypherpunks. And the ideas exchanged on that list over the next decade would lay the intellectual foundation for Bitcoin, for Tor, for Signal, for the entire ecosystem of privacy technology that hundreds of millions of people now use every day without knowing where it came from or who built it or why. But the technology, as important as it turned out to be, was almost secondary to the philosophy. Because the cypherpunks were not primarily technologists solving technical problems. They were political thinkers who had looked at the future that the Internet was building and seen something that almost no one else was seeing yet. Something that alarmed them deeply enough to dedicate their professional lives to fighting it. They saw the surveillance state. Before it existed. Before most people had any idea it was coming. They saw it with the clarity that comes from understanding both the technology and the political incentives that would inevitably push governments toward using that technology for control. Here is what they understood in 1992 that the rest of the world would not understand until Edward Snowden confirmed it in 2013. Every digital action leaves a trace. Every email sent. Every website visited. Every purchase made. Every call placed over a digital network. Every location pinged by a mobile device. All of it exists as data. And data can be stored indefinitely, searched instantly, correlated with other data to reveal patterns that no individual piece of information would suggest, and used by whoever controls the storage and the search tools. In the physical world of 1992, surveillance required resources. You had to assign specific agents to follow specific targets. You had to intercept specific communications by physically tapping specific lines. The cost of surveillance imposed a practical limit on its scale. Governments could monitor their most serious enemies. They could not monitor everyone. Digital surveillance was different. Digital surveillance scaled. Once the infrastructure existed to collect data, collecting more data cost almost nothing. Storage was cheap and getting cheaper. Processing power was growing exponentially. The same system that monitored one person could monitor 1 million people at essentially the same cost. The cypherpunks saw this clearly. And they made a decision that, in retrospect, looks prescient almost to the point of being uncanny. They decided that the only reliable protection against ubiquitous digital surveillance was mathematics. Specifically, cryptography. The science of turning readable information into unreadable noise that can only be decoded by someone who possesses the specific mathematical key. Strong cryptography, they argued, was the equalizer. The same mathematics that protected a government's most sensitive communications could protect an ordinary citizen's email. The same encryption that a bank used to secure financial transactions could secure a dissident's communications with journalists. The mathematics did not care who was using it. It protected everyone equally. And that equal protection was the entire point. Eric Hughes wrote the founding document of the cypherpunk movement in 1993. He called it a cypherpunks manifesto. It opens with a declaration that sounds simple but contains an entire political philosophy. Privacy is necessary for an open society in the electronic age. Hughes drew a distinction that is crucial and that most discussions of privacy miss entirely. Privacy, he wrote, is not secrecy. A private matter is something you do not want the whole world to know. A secret is something you do not want anyone to know. Privacy is the power to selectively reveal yourself to the world on your own terms. Secrecy is hiding from everyone. The right to privacy is the right to decide what you share and with whom. It is the right to have a conversation without that conversation being recorded and stored and potentially reviewed years later by people with power over your life. It is the right to explore ideas, including wrong ideas, including dangerous ideas, including ideas that authority disapproves of, without those explorations becoming a permanent part of a dossier that follows you everywhere. Without privacy, Hughes argued, there is no genuine free thought. Because free thought requires the freedom to think wrongly, to explore ideas you ultimately reject, to hold positions in private that you are not yet ready to defend in public. Surveillance colonizes the mind. People who know they are being watched self-censor. Not because they have done anything wrong, but because the knowledge of observation changes what we are willing to think. The cypherpunks understood something that the architects of digital surveillance systems either did not understand or did not care about. A world of total surveillance is not a world of total safety. It is a world of total conformity. And conformity is the death of the kind of creative, challenging, heterodox thinking that has driven every significant human advance. The secret societies of history had always known this. Every organization in this series existed partly or entirely because it needed to protect thinking that official authority wanted to suppress. The cypherpunks were making the same argument in the language of mathematics and computer science. Privacy is not a luxury. It is the condition that makes genuine intellectual freedom possible. The cypherpunks built tools to protect privacy from government surveillance long before most people understood that surveillance was happening. Were they visionaries protecting fundamental human rights, or were they naive about the ways their tools would be used by people with genuinely harmful intentions? Tell us what you think. This debate matters more today than it ever has. The battles the cypherpunks fought in the 1990s read today like origin stories of the world we now live in. Phil Zimmermann wrote a program called PGP. Pretty Good Privacy. It implemented public key cryptography in a form that anyone could download, install, and use. For the first time in history, a private individual with no special technical knowledge could encrypt their communications with the same level of security that had previously been available only to governments and major intelligence services. The United States government treated this as a national security threat. Under American law at the time, strong encryption was classified as a munition. The same legal category as tanks, missiles, and military aircraft. Exporting it to foreign nationals without a government license was a federal crime. And by posting PGP on the early internet, Zimmermann had effectively exported it to every person on Earth who could access a computer. The government opened a criminal investigation that lasted 3 years. Zimmermann and his supporters responded with a move of extraordinary elegance. They printed the entire PGP source code in a book. A physical, paper book, published and sold through normal commercial channels. Books were clearly protected by the First Amendment. The government could not restrict the export of a book. Any person anywhere in the world could buy the book, scan the pages, compile the code, and have working encryption software. The government had classified mathematics as a weapon. The cypherpunks had demonstrated that you cannot classify mathematics. You can restrict a specific implementation. You cannot restrict the underlying idea. And once an idea exists, it will be re-implemented by anyone who understands it. After 3 years of investigation and 0 prosecutions, the government dropped the case. In 1996, the Clinton administration began relaxing encryption export controls. By 2000, strong encryption was freely and legally available globally. The cypherpunks had won the first major battle of the cryptography wars. But the war itself was far from over. The Tor network emerged from a project funded by the United States Naval Research Laboratory. This fact is important and worth sitting with for a moment. The government that was trying to restrict encryption also funded the development of anonymous networking technology, because intelligence agencies need anonymous communication tools for their own operations. The technology that protects dissidents from authoritarian governments started as a military communication security project. Tor routes internet traffic through a series of volunteer-operated relay computers distributed around the world. Each relay knows only where it received the data and where it is sending it next. No single relay knows both the origin and the ultimate destination of any piece of data. The information is encrypted in multiple layers, with each relay removing one layer of encryption, like peeling an onion, hence the original name, the onion router. The practical result is that tracing internet traffic through Tor back to its origin requires compromising a significant portion of the entire relay network simultaneously, which with hundreds of thousands of relays distributed across dozens of countries, is practically impossible for any single actor, including large governments. Journalists in authoritarian countries use Tor to communicate with sources and with foreign media organizations without their communications being intercepted by government surveillance systems. Political dissidents use it to organize when organizing is illegal. Whistleblowers use it to reach journalists without being identified. Human rights organizations use it to collect testimony from witnesses in conflict zones where revealing identities could mean death. And criminals use it. Drug dealers. Fraudsters. People who trade in the worst kinds of content. The technology does not care. It protects everyone with equal mathematical rigor. This is the honest, uncomfortable truth about privacy technology that every serious discussion of it must acknowledge. There is no version of it that protects only the innocent. Strong privacy protection necessarily protects everyone. The question is not whether you can build privacy tools that only good people use. You cannot. The question is whether the benefits to the innocent outweigh the protection afforded to the guilty. The cypherpunks said yes, clearly and loudly, and built the tools anyway. History has validated their judgment more thoroughly than even they anticipated. To understand why Bitcoin matters in the context of secret societies, you first need to understand what money actually is at its most fundamental level. Money is trust. Specifically, it is trust that has been made transferable. When you hold a dollar bill, you hold a piece of paper that has value only because everyone who might accept it in exchange for something real believes that everyone else will accept it too. The dollar is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, which is another way of saying it is backed by collective confidence in an institution. That institution can inflate the currency, reducing its value. It can freeze accounts. It can confiscate assets. It can cut individuals and entire countries off from the global dollar-based financial system, as Iran, Russia, Venezuela, and others have discovered. Money, in the modern world, is ultimately a tool of political control. Not because of conspiracy. Because of structure. The financial system requires institutions. Institutions require legal authority. Legal authority is political. Therefore money is political. In ordinary circumstances, this connection is invisible. In extraordinary circumstances, it becomes very visible very quickly. Bitcoin was designed to break this connection. Satoshi Nakamoto's 9-page white paper described a system in which trust was replaced by mathematics, in which the need for a trusted institution to verify that money existed and had not already been spent elsewhere was replaced by a public record maintained simultaneously on thousands of computers around the world, no single one of which was in control. The blockchain, the chain of mathematical records that records every Bitcoin transaction ever made, is maintained by a global network of computers that are constantly checking each other's work. To add a false record, to spend money you do not have or to spend money you have already spent, you would need to convince more than half the computing power of the entire network to agree with your false version simultaneously. With the Bitcoin network now running on hundreds of thousands of computers drawing billions of dollars worth of electricity per year, this is practically impossible. No government controls the Bitcoin network. No company controls it. No person controls it. Not even Satoshi Nakamoto, who disappeared in 2011, controls it. The network runs on mathematical rules written into its code, executed automatically, verifiable by anyone, controllable by no one. This was the cypherpunk dream made fully real. A financial system that an authoritarian government could not freeze. That a desperate regime could not inflate. That a political enemy could not cut you off from. That required no bank's permission to use. That answered to no authority except mathematics. The identity of Satoshi Nakamoto remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the 21st century. Researchers have analyzed the white paper's writing style and compared it to thousands of academic papers and online writings, looking for stylistic fingerprints. The timestamps on early Bitcoin-related posts suggest someone operating in a time zone that could be British or European, though this could easily have been faked. The spelling choices in Satoshi's communications are British in some posts and American in others, suggesting either a person who had lived in both places or a person deliberately obfuscating their origin. Multiple people have been named as Satoshi over the years. A cryptographer named Hal Finney, who died in 2014, was for a time a leading candidate, partly because he received the very first Bitcoin transaction ever sent. Nick Szabo, whose BitGold proposal anticipated many of Bitcoin's features, has been suggested. A computer scientist and businessman named Craig Wright has repeatedly claimed to be Satoshi and has repeatedly failed to provide convincing cryptographic proof of the claim. Most of the Bitcoin community believes that the real Satoshi Nakamoto has remained perfectly silent since 2011. And that the approximately 1 million Bitcoin in the wallet addresses associated with Satoshi's early mining activity, Bitcoin worth tens of billions of dollars at peak prices, has never been touched. If Satoshi is a single living person, they are sitting on one of the largest individual fortunes in human history and have chosen to live in complete anonymity rather than claim it. If Satoshi is already dead, the coins will never move and the identity will never be revealed. Either way, the achievement stands. The most consequential act of anonymous creation in the history of finance, performed by a person or group that understood better than anyone how to make themselves permanently unreachable while leaving behind something that could not be stopped. The Egyptian priests of 3,000 years ago would have recognized the strategy immediately. Build your power into a system that does not require you to remain present to continue operating. Make yourself unnecessary to the thing you created. Disappear before anyone thinks to look for you. If you were Satoshi Nakamoto, with billions in Bitcoin and the ability to reveal yourself and become one of the most famous people on Earth, would you come forward? Or would you stay hidden? What do you think Satoshi's reasons for staying anonymous actually are? Give us your theory in the comments. The best theories will be featured in our next video. In 2008, the Church of Scientology made a mistake. They tried to suppress a video. The video featured one of their most famous members, an actor, speaking enthusiastically about his beliefs in a way that many viewers found strange or embarrassing. The church's lawyers sent takedown notices to websites hosting the video. They tried to scrub it from the internet. The internet does not scrub easily. And a portion of the internet had decided that this act of suppression was unacceptable. Anonymous was about to introduce itself to the world. To understand Anonymous, you need to understand the website that created it. 4chan is an image board, a type of website where users can post images and comments without creating accounts. Because no account is needed, every post is attributed by default to the username that the site assigns automatically. That username is anonymous. What started as a technical accident, every user appearing to post under the same name, became something sociologically fascinating. Over time, the 4chan community began to treat Anonymous not as a default username but as a collective identity. They began referring to themselves as anonymous, not as individuals but as a hive mind. A swarm. A force of nature that emerged from the aggregated decisions of millions of people who had never met and would never meet, coordinated not by any leader but by shared culture and shared values. This is genuinely new in the history of human organization. Every previous collective identity had required some form of physical gathering, or shared institutional membership, or at minimum a communication channel that allowed coordination to happen. Anonymous required none of these things. The identity was distributed. Anyone could claim it. No one controlled it. It existed in the cultural space between millions of people, without being located in any of them. When the Church of Scientology tried to suppress that video, Anonymous coordinated something they called Project Shenology. Distributed denial of service attacks crashed Scientology websites. Prank calls flooded Scientology phone lines. Fake delivery orders arrived at Scientology offices. And in something genuinely unexpected, actual human beings put on masks and showed up in physical space to protest outside Scientology buildings in cities around the world. The masks were Guy Fawkes masks, borrowed from the film V for Vendetta. They became the visual symbol of Anonymous precisely because they expressed the collective's core idea perfectly. The mask was not hiding an individual identity. It was replacing individual identity with collective identity. Anyone wearing it was anonymous. The mask was the membership card of an organization with no membership. The operations that followed Shenology established Anonymous as a genuine force in the digital world. Operation Payback targeted financial companies that had cut off WikiLeaks from payment processing. PayPal, Visa, and MasterCard all saw their websites brought down by coordinated denial of service attacks from thousands of anonymous participants who downloaded attack tools and pointed them at the target simultaneously. These were not sophisticated technical attacks. They were digital versions of the kind of mass civil disobedience that has always been part of political resistance. Everyone doing a small thing at the same time to create an effect that no individual could create alone. The leak of H.B. Gary federal emails in 2011 was more sophisticated and more consequential. H.B. Gary Federal was a private security company whose CEO had publicly claimed to have identified anonymous leaders and intended to hand the information to the FBI. Anonymous hacked H.B. Gary Federal systems, read the emails, and released them publicly. The emails revealed something that went far beyond the question of anonymous leadership. They showed H.B. Gary Federal developing plans to create fake online personas to manipulate public discussion, to run disinformation campaigns against journalists critical of corporations, to collect and weaponize personal information about activists. The company had been marketing these capabilities to major corporations and to government agencies. By trying to unmask Anonymous, HB Gary Federal had been unmasked itself. The company collapsed. The CEO resigned. The story became a major reference point in debates about the private surveillance industry. The paradox at the heart of Anonymous is the question that every organization theorist eventually asks about it. How does it actually work? Traditional organizations work through hierarchy. Someone is in charge. They make decisions. They communicate those decisions down the chain. People execute. If you remove the top of the hierarchy, the organization becomes confused or collapses. Anonymous has no hierarchy. There is no one in charge. There are no decisions being communicated down a chain. There is no chain. What Anonymous has instead is what might be called emergent coordination. Someone, somewhere, proposes an operation. They describe a target, a method, and a purpose, in a public forum where other anonymous participants can see it. Other participants evaluate the proposal on its merits. Those who agree with the proposal participate. Those who disagree do not. If enough people participate, the operation has an effect. If too few people participate, it fails and the proposer tries something else or gives up. No authority validates the proposal. No vote is taken. No consensus is required. The operation either attracts enough voluntary participation to be effective or it does not. This is democracy stripped to its absolute essentials. Pure voluntary action, coordinated by nothing except shared values and the individual judgment of each participant about whether a specific proposed action is worth their time and risk. Law enforcement found this deeply, genuinely frustrating. To stop a traditional organization, you identify the leadership and arrest them. The organization loses direction and collapses. Anonymous had no leadership to arrest. When law enforcement identified and prosecuted specific individuals who had participated in specific operations, other participants who had not been identified continued. When they shut down one communication channel, the community moved to another. Every tactical victory against Anonymous generated essentially no strategic progress against the phenomenon. You cannot arrest an idea. And Anonymous was, at its core, an idea with a costume. Anonymous represents something genuinely new in the history of collective action. No leaders. No membership. No organization. Just shared identity and voluntary coordination. But without accountability, how do you prevent the most extreme or harmful members from doing terrible things in the collective's name? Is leaderless organization a strength or a fatal flaw? Tell us your honest assessment in the comments. Anonymous demonstrated that the digital age had made something possible that had never been possible before. A secret society with no secrets, no members, and no structure, that was nonetheless more resistant to external attack than any secret society in history had ever been. The Templars were destroyed when a king decided their assets were worth more than their existence. Anonymous cannot be destroyed because there is nothing to destroy. Arrest every participant in a specific operation and Anonymous is still there, because Anonymous is not those participants. It is the idea that anyone can be anonymous whenever they choose to be. This represents the logical endpoint of the compartmentalization principle that the early Christians had invented out of necessity. If each cell knows only itself, arresting one cell does not compromise the rest. Anonymous took this principle to its absolute limit. Each participant knows only themselves. There is nothing else to compromise. In February 2011, a 26-year-old named Ross Ulbricht launched a website. It was accessible only through Tor. It accepted only Bitcoin. It was a marketplace where buyers and sellers could conduct anonymous transactions for goods that governments prohibited. He called it Silk Road. At its peak, Silk Road was processing millions of dollars in transactions per month. Thousands of vendors. Tens of thousands of buyers. A complete, functioning underground economy operating in the digital equivalent of the catacombs, visible only to those who knew how to reach it, invisible to everyone else. The goods sold were primarily illegal drugs. And Albrecht, who operated under the username Dread Pirate Roberts borrowed from his favorite film, was clear about his reasons for building it. He believed the war on drugs was morally wrong. He believed adults had the right to make their own decisions about what they put into their own bodies. He believed that a marketplace where sellers competed on quality and reliability, where reviews and ratings created accountability without revealing identities, would actually make drug use safer by reducing the violence and unpredictability of street markets. The FBI hunted him for more than 2 years. They knew Silk Road existed. They accessed it. They watched it function. They saw the listings, the reviews, the transaction volumes. They knew it was run by someone called Dread Pirate Roberts. And they could not find him, because the architecture of the system, Tor plus Bitcoin plus careful operational security, had been specifically designed to prevent exactly that kind of identification. Albrecht's mistake was human rather than technical. In the very early days of building Silk Road, before he understood what he was creating and what it would require, he had posted about it online using his real email address. He had mentioned it in forums using accounts that could be connected to his real identity. Digital breadcrumbs from a time before he understood the need for perfect operational security. The FBI found those breadcrumbs. Patient forensic investigation connecting early accounts to later ones through technical metadata that Albrecht had not known to obscure eventually pointed investigators to a 29-year-old man in San Francisco. They arrested him in October 2013 in a public library, approaching him while his laptop was open and logged into the Silk Road administrator interface, taking the laptop before any encryption could lock them out. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No violent crime had been committed. The sentence was widely considered excessive even by people who had no sympathy for Silk Road. The government was sending a message intended to deter others from attempting the same thing. The message did not work. Within days of Silk Road seizure, replacement markets had launched. Within months, the successor ecosystem was larger than Silk Road at its peak. The model proved perfectly resilient to the removal of any single instance. The marketplace idea, the combination of Tor and Bitcoin and cryptographic identity, would simply be rebuilt by someone else every time law enforcement took one instance offline. This demonstrated something fundamental about the relationship between technology, human desire, and prohibition. If a technology makes something possible, and there is genuine human demand for that thing, the technology will be used to supply that demand regardless of legal prohibition. The technology does not care about the law. The technology only responds to what is technically possible and what people actually want. The dark web, the portion of the internet accessible only through anonymizing networks like Tor, contains much more than drug markets. It contains political forums for people in authoritarian countries who cannot speak freely on the ordinary internet. It contains whistleblower submission systems that allow people to send sensitive documents to journalists and human rights organizations without being identified. It contains communications infrastructure for activists operating in places where organizing is illegal. It also contains genuinely terrible things. The worst things that human beings do to each other and to those who cannot protect themselves. The technology protects the dissident and the predator with equal mathematical indifference. This is not a comfortable fact. It does not resolve into a clean moral conclusion. The honest answer is that the same technology that enables freedom enables crime, and there is no technical fix for this. There is only the political and social question of which values you prioritize and what trade-offs you are willing to accept. Ross Ulbricht built a marketplace that many libertarians argue caused no direct harm, where adults voluntarily traded with other adults, and received a life sentence. At the same time, people who ran far more traditionally harmful businesses have received far lighter sentences. Do you think the punishment fit the crime? Or do you think the government was making an example of him specifically because of what Silk Road represented ideologically? Tell us your honest view. Every year, in a European hotel whose location rotates among Western countries, approximately 150 of the most powerful people on earth gather for 3 days of closed-door conversations. Sitting prime ministers, former presidents, central bank governors, finance ministers, CEOs of the world's largest banks, technology companies, defense contractors, and media organizations, senior military officers, editors of major newspapers, professors from elite universities. No journalists are admitted. No minutes are taken. The Chatham House rule applies. Participants may discuss what they learned in general terms afterward, but they may not attribute specific statements to specific individuals. What was said stays unattributed. When they leave, most of them say very little publicly about what was discussed. This is the Bilderberg Group. It has been meeting annually since 1954. It is completely real. Its existence is public. Participation lists are eventually released. But the actual conversations, what these extraordinarily powerful people actually said to each other behind closed doors, are protected by the same principle that has protected important conversations throughout the entire history of secret societies. Candor requires privacy. The Bilderberg Group is the most famous of a category of organizations that now shapes global affairs more directly than any Masonic lodge or Illuminati cell ever did or could have. But it is far from the only one. The Council on Foreign Relations has operated in New York since 1921. Its membership has included virtually every significant American foreign policy figure for a century. Secretaries of State, CIA directors, national security advisors, senior military commanders, leading academics in international relations, editors of major publications. It publishes the journal Foreign Affairs, which is required reading in every foreign policy institution in the world. It holds public events. And it holds private dinners and meetings where the conversations that actually shape the thinking of American foreign policy happen in an environment where frank assessment is possible without the performance that public settings require. The World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, operates on a larger and more visible scale. Media covers the public sessions. Leaders make speeches that are broadcast globally. But the real work happens in the private meetings that run alongside the public conference. The bilateral conversations between heads of state. The invitation-only dinners where genuine positions are expressed rather than public positions performed. The informal networks that are built and maintained in hotel corridors and private lounges. The Trilateral Commission brings together leaders from North America, Europe, and Japan to coordinate on issues of common concern. The Business Roundtable in America aggregates the CEOs of the largest corporations to develop coordinated positions on regulatory and policy questions. Industry associations of every kind perform similar functions in their specific domains. Each one creates a space where the people who make consequential decisions can speak honestly to each other, outside the constraints of public accountability. What do these organizations actually do? Is the conspiracy version of what they do even close to accurate? No. The conspiracy version imagines these organizations as command and control systems. Hidden masters issuing orders that governments and corporations execute. A unified agenda being imposed on the world by a small group of people who have decided what is best for everyone else. The reality is simultaneously less dramatic and more troubling. These organizations are not command and control systems. They are consensus-building systems. No one issues orders. No one makes binding decisions. What happens instead is that powerful people who share certain assumptions about how the world works and what is valuable spend time talking to each other. They arrive at rough consensus about which approaches to major problems seem most promising. They identify which ideas seem credible and which do not. They develop shared frameworks for understanding issues that they then carry back to their institutions and apply in their individual decision-making. The power is not in the decisions made at these meetings. The power is in the assumptions that are reinforced, the framings that are accepted as normal, the ideas that get treated as serious and the ideas that get dismissed. The power is in what these conversations make it natural to think, because what it is natural to think shapes what it is possible to do. This is the subtlest and most pervasive form of power that has ever existed. It does not require anyone to order anyone else around. It does not require conspiracy. It requires only that the people who make the most consequential decisions share the same basic framework for understanding the world. And shared frameworks are built by shared conversations, over time, among people who see each other regularly, trust each other's intelligence, and gradually converge on common understandings. The conspiracy theorist's question is, who is in charge? The more useful question is, whose assumptions do the decision-makers share? Because whoever shaped those assumptions shaped the decisions, even if they never gave a single order. The Bilderberg Group, the Council on Foreign Relations, and similar organizations bring together the most powerful people in the world for candid, private conversations. Defenders say this is necessary for complex global problems. Critics say it is unaccountable elite coordination that bypasses democracy. Which side do you find more convincing? Tell us where you stand and why. In 2016, an experiment called the DAO raised $150 million in a matter of weeks. The DAO, which stood for Decentralized Autonomous Organization, was not a company. It had no CEO, no board of directors, no employees, no offices, no legal registration in any country. It was a set of rules written in computer code, running on the Ethereum blockchain, that allowed token holders to vote on how to allocate its resources. The code enforced the rules automatically. No human authority was needed to ensure compliance. The mathematics did it. The experiment ended badly. A vulnerability in the code allowed an attacker to drain approximately $60 million from the system before anyone could stop it. Because the code was the law, and the code permitted what the attacker did, there was intense philosophical debate about whether what had happened was even theft in any meaningful sense. Eventually the community made the highly controversial decision to rewrite the history of the blockchain to undo the attack, which violated one of the core principles that were supposed to make blockchain technology trustworthy. The DAO failed. But the concept did not. The idea of an organization that operates entirely through code, whose rules are enforced by mathematics rather than by human authority, whose membership is defined by digital token ownership, and which can operate across national boundaries without being subject to the law of any particular country, this idea proved too powerful and too appealing to die with one implementation. Decentralized autonomous organizations are now a significant feature of the cryptocurrency ecosystem. They govern major blockchain protocols. They manage investment funds. They coordinate open-source software development. Some of them control hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. Now add artificial intelligence to this picture and consider where it leads. Imagine a near future in which each person has an AI agent that represents their interests in the digital world. The agent knows your values, your preferences, your constraints, your goals. It acts on your behalf in negotiations, in transactions, in coordination with other people's agents. You describe what you want and the AI figures out how to get it. In this world, collective action becomes possible without collective identity. You do not need to know who else shares your values. You do not need to coordinate with them directly. Your AI finds others whose agents share compatible goals and coordinates with them automatically. A shared purpose creates collective behavior without anyone consciously deciding to act collectively. This is the logical endpoint of the anonymous model. Anonymous showed that collective action was possible without knowing who your fellow participants were. AI agents would make collective action possible without even the shared cultural identity that Anonymous required. Your agent would coordinate with agents whose values align with yours, and you would not need to know who owns those agents or even that the coordination was happening. The intelligence agencies that have spent decades developing techniques to monitor, infiltrate, and disrupt human organizations would face a genuinely new challenge. You cannot arrest an AI agent. You cannot turn one against the organization by threatening it with prison. You cannot seduce it with ideology or money. You cannot apply the time-honored techniques of human intelligence to a system that has no human psychology to exploit. Physical geography is also going to matter in ways that most people have not yet thought about. For 3,000 years, the most effective way to escape the reach of a powerful state was to go somewhere that the state's authority did not extend. Medieval heretics went to places where the church's influence was weak. Pirates established themselves in waters that no navy consistently patrolled. Revolutionary movements used border regions where the pursuing government's reach was limited by jurisdiction. Space is the ultimate ungoverned territory. Private space stations are no longer theoretical. Companies are actively developing and operating them. Lunar bases are being planned and funded. The first serious designs for permanent Mars habitation are being worked on by organizations with the resources to attempt them. A community on a lunar base, or in an orbital station, or on Mars, is physically isolated from Earth's governments by distances that make real-time enforcement essentially impossible. Communication delays mean that real-time direction from any Earth-based authority is impractical. The community would need to develop its own governance, its own rules, its own institutions. And human communities have always generated hidden networks alongside their public institutions. The same psychological needs that drove the mystery cults of ancient Greece and the guild systems of medieval Europe and the Masonic lodges of the Enlightenment will drive the communities of space. The need to belong to something exclusive. The need to hold knowledge that others do not have. The need to coordinate with trusted others outside official channels. The secret societies of space will look nothing like the secret societies of history. But they will serve the same human needs, using whatever technologies are available in their environment, for the same fundamental reasons. Because secrecy, and the trust and power that come with it, are not historical artifacts. They are human constants that we have traveled together from the temples of ancient Egypt to the encrypted forums of the modern dark web. Across 30 centuries and every continent. Through mystery cults and medieval guilds, warrior monks and revolutionary cells, Victorian occultists and digital anarchists. 7 patterns run through all of it. Master these 7 patterns and you will see power operating around you in ways that were invisible before. Secret societies are born when important conversations cannot happen openly. The early Christians met in catacombs because Rome would execute them for worshipping openly. The Carbonari organized in forest clearings because the Austrian Empire would imprison them for organizing in public. The Freemasons of pre-revolutionary Paris created lodges where cross-class conversation could happen because the society outside the lodge made it impossible. The cypherpunks built encrypted networks because governments were building surveillance infrastructure that would otherwise monitor everything. Look around your world right now. Where are the conversations that cannot happen publicly? In corporate offices where people cannot speak honestly about what the organization is actually doing? In countries where certain political opinions result in imprisonment? In communities whose values the mainstream culture suppresses or punishes? In professional environments where honest assessment is penalized and performance is rewarded? Every one of those spaces is a potential birthplace of a new secret society. Because the human need for honest conversation with trusted people does not go away when official channels make those conversations dangerous. It goes underground. Information asymmetry is the root of all durable power. The Egyptian priests were powerful because they knew when the Nile would flood and no one else did. The Templar bankers were powerful because they controlled the only reliable international financial system. Intelligence agencies are powerful because they have access to information that elected officials cannot see. Technology companies are powerful in the 21st century because their algorithms know more about human behavior than humans themselves know about their own behavior. In every era and every context, the organization that controls access to critical information controls the decisions that information informs. This is more true today than it has ever been. The most valuable asset in the modern economy is not land, not capital, not even labor. It is data. The organizations that have the most complete and highest quality data make better decisions faster than organizations that do not. And the organizations that can prevent others from accessing the same data extend that advantage indefinitely. The cypherpunks understood this. Bitcoin was designed around it. The entire history of secret societies is a story about information asymmetry: who has it, how they protect it, what they do with it, and what happens when someone else gets it. Every secret society is primarily a network. The spiritual content, the revolutionary ideology, the esoteric knowledge, these attract members. But the network is what retains them and what creates lasting value. The Eleusinian initiates gained access to a trusted network spanning the entire ancient Mediterranean, cutting across ethnic and class lines in ways that ordinary social structures did not allow. The Freemasons gained access to an international network of trusted contacts that made travel and commerce significantly safer and more profitable. The members of Skull and Bones gain access to a network of high-achieving, mutually committed people that has been accumulating human capital and professional relationships for nearly 2 centuries. The secrets create the bond. The network creates the value. Understanding this distinction explains why organizations that lose their ideological coherence often survive. The members may no longer believe the stated purpose. But the network continues to function, continues to create value, continues to give people reasons to maintain their membership and their loyalty. Visibility is always the enemy of hidden power. The Knights Templar built an empire of wealth and military capability that rivaled kingdoms. They survived for nearly 2 centuries by maintaining a careful balance between being visible enough to be trusted and useful, and hidden enough to protect their operations. The moment their wealth made them impossible to ignore and their power made them threatening to the French king, they were destroyed in a single dawn raid. The Bavarian Illuminati tried to infiltrate European governments and were undone when a dead courier scattered their documents across a Bavarian road. Anonymous was most effective when it was truly leaderless and untraceable, and became vulnerable when specific individuals were identified and prosecuted. Every secret society faces this tension. To recruit members, to have impact, to matter at all, you must be visible enough that people know you exist. But visibility is exactly what attracts the attention of powers capable of destroying you. The organizations that survive longest are the ones that find ways to influence events without ever becoming visible enough to attract coordinated opposition. In the modern world, this means hiding in the mundane. Appearing as an ordinary institution rather than a mysterious brotherhood. Doing the work of a secret society while looking like a conference, a club, a policy forum. Secret societies preserve ideas before they are ready for the world. Religious tolerance was discussed in underground meetings of persecuted minorities for centuries before it became a legal principle. The equality of human beings before the law was debated in Masonic lodges before it became constitutional doctrine. Digital privacy was articulated by cypherpunks before most people understood what they were about to lose. The right of peoples to national self-determination was nurtured in carbonary cells before it became a recognized principle of international law. Secret societies function as incubators for ideas that the mainstream is not yet ready to accept. They provide the protected space in which those ideas can develop, be argued over, be refined, be stress-tested against opposition, and build bodies of committed supporters before they face the full weight of official disapproval. If you want to know what the mainstream will believe in 30 years, look at what the committed underground communities believe today. Not all of it. Much of it will be wrong. But somewhere in those encrypted forums and private channels and small tight-knit communities of passionate people, the seeds of tomorrow's common sense are already growing. Pattern 6. Documentation is the only thing that separates history from myth. We know the Freemasons influenced the American Revolution because the records are there. Lodge membership lists. Meeting minutes. Correspondence between Masons who were also founders. The documentary record is rich enough that historians can make measured, defensible claims about specific mechanisms of influence. We know the Bavarian Illuminati existed for 11 years and accomplished essentially nothing, despite what 2.5 centuries of conspiracy theory attribute to them, because the Bavarian state archives contain their actual records. We can read their membership lists and their correspondence and their organizational plans and see what they actually were versus what legend says they were. Where records are complete, influence can be assessed with reasonable accuracy. Where records are absent, myth fills the void. And myth is not constrained by what actually happened. Myth is constrained only by what makes a satisfying story. Which is why the most poorly documented organizations, the Illuminati, the Rosicrucians, the earliest mystery cults, have the most extravagant legends attached to them. The lesson for you, as someone trying to understand the world, is simple. When someone tells you about a secret organization's power, ask for documentation. Real conspiracies leave real traces. Watergate left tape recordings. Iran-Contra left financial records. Operation Ajax left CIA documents that were eventually declassified. Real power exercised in secret eventually produces evidence that surfaces. Conspiracy theories survive by explaining away the absence of evidence as proof of the conspiracy's power. These are not the same thing. Pattern 7. The technology changes. The human needs never do. The need to belong to a community that feels exclusive and meaningful. The desire to possess knowledge that others do not have. The satisfaction of being part of something that matters beyond individual life. The comfort of trusting certain people completely in a world where most relationships are uncertain. The power that comes from coordinating with others toward shared goals through channels that opponents cannot monitor or disrupt. These psychological needs have been constant across every culture, every century, every technological era in recorded human history. They generated the mystery cults of ancient Greece and the guild systems of medieval Europe and the Masonic lodges of the Enlightenment and the revolutionary cells of 19th century nationalism and the digital collectives of the 21st century Internet. The forms will keep changing as technology changes. As AI develops, as genetic verification becomes possible, as space becomes habitable, as whatever technologies come after those emerge, new forms of collective secret organization will be invented by people using the tools available in their moment to serve the same needs that have driven every secret society in history. The specific form is always new. The underlying human need is always old. Understanding this means you will never be surprised by a new form of secret society, because you understand what it is serving regardless of what it looks like. We have traveled a long way together. 3,000 years. 6 continents. Every form of human organization from stone temples to blockchain networks. And now it is time for the conclusion that the entire journey has been building toward. The greatest conspiracy theory about secret societies is that they control the world. A small group of people, in a room somewhere, pulling strings. Orchestrating events. Directing history. The Illuminati, the Freemasons, the Bilderberg Group, the Skull and Bones. Hidden masters operating the machinery of civilization for their own benefit. This theory is wrong. Not partially wrong. Almost completely wrong, in the specific sense that it describes. No small group of people controls the world. The world is too complex, too chaotic, too constantly surprising for any organization, however sophisticated, to control. The people who attend Bilderberg cannot agree on what to order for dinner, let alone coordinate the entire global economy for generations. The members of Skull and Bones have opposed each other on every major political question of the last century. The Freemasons fought on opposite sides of every war for 300 years. The conspiracy theory version of elite power is actually more comforting than the reality. Because a conspiracy can be exposed and defeated. Find the hidden masters. Reveal their plans. Remove them from power. Problem solved. The reality is more difficult to confront. The real concentration of power in the modern world is not hidden. It is visible, documented, and legal. It operates through entirely normal institutional mechanisms that most people either accept as inevitable or do not think about at all. Economic inequality is documented and measurable. The wealthiest 1% of humanity owns more than the bottom 50% combined. This is not because of a secret conspiracy. It is because of tax policies, inheritance laws, capital gain structures, housing regulations, educational access, and dozens of other entirely visible, entirely legal structural features of modern economies that systematically advantage people who already have advantage. Political influence follows money in ways that are openly studied by political scientists and openly reported by journalists. Lobbying is legal. Campaign contributions are legal. The revolving door between regulatory agencies and the industries they regulate is legal and documented. The mechanisms by which wealth converts into political power are not hidden. They are hiding in plain sight, in systems that most people accept as normal because they have existed for long enough to seem inevitable. The information systems that shape what billions of people believe and how they understand the world are controlled by a small number of technology companies whose algorithms make decisions about what content to amplify and what to suppress in ways that no one outside the companies can examine or audit. This is not secret. It is structural. The power is not in a conspiracy. It is in the architecture. The distinction between these two framings matters enormously for what you do about them. Conspiracy thinking says, find the hidden masters and expose them. Structural thinking says, change the structures that produce these outcomes. Conspiracy thinking produces paranoia, often targets scapegoats, and frequently leads toward violence against people who are blamed for systemic problems they did not create. Structural thinking produces policy proposals, political organizing, legal challenges, and the kind of sustained effort that actually changes the distribution of power over time. The real secret societies of today are not wearing robes in candlelit rooms. They are sitting in glass office towers, negotiating government contracts, writing software, managing investments, hosting conferences, publishing academic papers, and doing all the other entirely ordinary things that constitute the exercise of power in the modern world. Understanding this is the most important thing this entire series has tried to teach. Not that secret societies are more powerful than you thought, but that power does not need secrecy to be real and to be consequential. That the most durable power is often the most visible power, the power that has been so thoroughly normalized that most people do not recognize it as power at all. After everything we have covered across this entire series, from Egyptian temples to the dark web, from the Knights Templar to Anonymous, here is the question we most want your honest answer to. Do you think ordinary people today have more power or less power to challenge concentrated elite power than the Carbonari did in the 19th century or the early Christians did in the Roman Empire? Have our tools gotten better or has the power we face gotten stronger? Tell us your answer in the comments. We will feature the most thoughtful responses in our next production. You came to this series, probably, with some version of one of two beliefs. Either that secret societies are far more powerful than anyone admits, or that they are fantasies invented by paranoid minds. The truth we have documented across this entire journey is that neither of these is right. Secret societies are real. They have shaped history in ways that can be documented and measured. They have provided the organizational infrastructure for revolutions, the networks for distributing forbidden knowledge, the protected spaces for ideas that later became the foundations of civilization. They deserve to be taken seriously as historical forces. And the most powerful forms of hidden coordination operating today are not the kind that conspiracy theorists imagine. They are the mundane, the legal, the institutionalized versions of the same principles. The private meetings of powerful people. The elite networks that reproduce themselves across generations. The structural inequalities that compound over time because the systems that produce them are treated as natural rather than as choices. Take this knowledge and do something useful with it. Be skeptical of certainty. Anyone who tells you they know exactly who pulls all the strings does not understand how power works. Power is contested, distributed among competing interests, constantly negotiated and renegotiated. There are no all-powerful hidden masters. There are many powerful actors with different and often conflicting interests. The world is not a conspiracy. It is a competition. Understanding the difference changes how you think about almost everything. Follow the documents. When someone tells you about the secret power of a hidden organization, ask for evidence. Real power exercised in secret eventually leaves real traces. If the traces are absent, be skeptical. If the evidence is there, take it seriously regardless of how uncomfortable it is. Look at the structures, not just the conspiracies. The most important concentrations of power in the world today are visible, legal, and structural. They can be challenged through organizing, voting, legal advocacy, journalism, and the sustained democratic pressure that has always been the most effective tool ordinary people have had against extraordinary concentrations of power. And remember that the game has always been going on. 3,000 years of secret societies, hidden networks, and the contest between those who want to know everything and those who want to keep their secrets. Every generation has faced new versions of this contest. Every generation has had to figure out for itself where the balance between transparency and privacy should lie, who gets to keep secrets from whom, and what the exercise of hidden power costs the people over whom it is exercised. You are now part of an informed generation that understands the history of this contest, that understands the patterns, that can recognize the game when it is being played around you. The priests of Egypt watched the stars and turned their knowledge into power. The initiates of Eleusis kept a secret for 1,000 years. The Templars built the first international bank. The Freemasons helped light the fuse of democratic revolution. The cypherpunks encrypted the internet. The anonymous millions built a collective that could not be arrested or infiltrated or destroyed. All of them were playing the same game. The game of who knows what, who trusts whom, and what becomes possible when people coordinate outside the view of power. The game is still going. You are already in it. Now you know the rules. And now you know how to play. If this series changed the way you see the world, share it with someone who needs to see it. Every single comment is read. The most insightful responses will be featured in our next production. Thank you for going on this journey with us. The next one begins soon. And it goes even deeper.